Chapter 2748. Of course, this didn't mean that Luo Fan could be unscrupulous. After all, this was a world created by the world's creator, and even if he couldn't discover such an obvious flaw for a while. However, if Luo Fan ignored it and treated it as normal, and didn't spend more effort to hide himself, he would still be easily discovered in the end. Luo Fan was clearly aware of this. At this moment, the will of his incarnation took advantage of the opportunity when the world's creator didn't notice and instantly integrated itself into the world's laws. He couldn't be more familiar with this behavior. Don't forget that there was an existence like the heavenly Tao in his world of laws. The heavenly Tao had various characteristics, and one of them was that it had the characteristics of the laws and willpower. In this way, it went without saying that Luo Fan, who created the heavenly Tao and even used the incarnation of the heavenly Tao to complete many transactions for him, had a deep understanding of the laws and willpower. At this moment, it was really a matter of a thought for him to simulate such an existence. Soon, his entire will seemed to have completely transformed into the willpower of a certain star world. It began to help the laws of that world operate. It was like a natural thing in that world. With this change, all the abnormalities seemed to have disappeared. The entire world seemed to have completely returned to the state it was before Luo Fan invaded it. And because his entire consciousness had awakened, he no longer tried his best to urge those body parts to reawaken, nor did he make those scattered body parts work hard to give life to inanimate objects or try to possess them. Because he no longer tried hard to urge those body parts, the number of failures of those body parts that had yet to truly awaken suddenly increased. The body parts that could have reached their goal in dozens or hundreds of times now required tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of times to grasp that slim chance of truly awakening. However, this obviously didn't have much impact on Luo Fan's incarnation. After all, compared to the will as a whole, the awakening of these body parts could increase the strength and abilities of the body. But even if the body parts were not awakened, even if the body parts were to remain in their original state of being hazy and scattered, there wouldn't be too much damage to the body. The will of the incarnation would still be complete and flawless, and it wouldn't be deceived. In this way, it didn't matter whether he awakened it or not. In fact, if one were to be more precise, it would be even more perfect for those body parts to maintain their scattered and hazy state. After all, as long as these body parts remained scattered and hazy, there wouldn't be any abnormal clues that would appear. They would appear more similar to the ordinary things in this world, and when they blended into the world, it would be even more undetectable. However, it was clear that if he did not pay attention to it and allowed these body parts to scatter and become hazy, it would be too passive. Even if it was convenient for a moment, it would definitely hinder the final result he wanted. Therefore, Luo Fan chose to not actively urge the body parts of a she to awaken, nor did he prevent these body parts from instinctively awakening. Instead, he let nature take its course, allowing them to take into account both stealth and speed as much as possible. As these body parts continued to awaken, the will of Luo Fan's incarnation had already begun to gradually extend its perceptual feelers beyond the many worlds. The countless stars and worlds in this world were all extremely mysterious. They seemed to be drifting and scattered, but in reality, they were still deeply connected to one another. It was because of this deep connection that the many worlds in the starry sky did not remain the same. Instead, they cycled according to some extremely profound and complicated law. This deep connection made it possible for Luo Fan to extend his perception to the entire starry sky from this world, and even the entire world. Of course, at this moment, he couldn't be too anxious and reveal any traces. Even if he seemed to have deceived the creator of the world and made the world accept his identity as the world will of a certain star, he wouldn't be complacent because of this. In the process of extending his perceptual feelers out, his speed was extremely slow. The process of extending his perception was even more natural and obscure. If one were to look at the results of his actions, it would feel as if the world will of a certain star had suddenly awakened and begun to explore the many stars outside of its own world. And although this kind of behavior was not common in the stars that filled the sky, it was not non-existent. The number of stars that filled the sky was probably calculated in the hundreds of millions of trillions. With so many worlds, there were naturally all kinds of them. There were also worlds with world wheels. Of course, these world wheels naturally couldn't be as perfect and clear as the so-called world of laws formed by Luo Fan's incarnation. However, there were also some world wheels that were above perfect and clear and could recognize the fact that the world they were in was only an insignificant one among the infinite stars. And such world wheels would naturally begin to explore outwards, work hard to perceive other worlds, and even perceive the essence of this world. In fact, compared to the behavior of Luo Fan's incarnation, their actions were even more unscrupulous, almost as if they could not wait to show their existence to the creator of this world. In this situation, the actions of Luo Fan's incarnation at this time didn't seem out of place. Luo Fan's incarnation's perception continued to explore outwards, and the way it stumbled was very similar to the real world with such a performance. Even if the creator of the world was always paying attention to the changes in this star world, it was unlikely that he would discover his abnormality immediately, not to mention that the creator of the world had more important things to do at this time. With this convenience, the will of Luo Fan's incarnation gradually brought more and more star worlds into his senses. His will constantly invaded the laws of those worlds, bringing more and more of the laws of those star worlds into his control. Once a star world was under his control, it was as if he had turned into the world will of that world's world wills, as if he had completely integrated with it. In this way, he looked like the world will of a world that was constantly expanding outwards, continuously devouring one star world after another. Of course, during this process, Luo Fan naturally adjusted himself according to his understanding of the possible manifestations of the world will, making his performance as compatible with the real world will as much as possible. Perhaps this method was quite effective, because in the end, when he finally fully controlled a certain star domain in the starry sky, he didn't attract any attention even when he seemed to have turned into the entire will of this star domain. Be it the creator of the world or anyone else, no one noticed his abnormality, and he directly controlled this star domain. At this point, Luo Fan knew very well that he had to stop. Controlling this star domain could be considered as occupying over 10 million star worlds, which was considered to have expanded by 10 million times. However, compared to this entire world, it was still insignificant. The creator of the world still wouldn't focus his precious attention on such a small place and pay attention to such a small change. However, if he continued to expand and continued to bring more star worlds into his control, the situation would probably change quite a bit. The greater the proportion he occupied in the entire world, the greater the possibility that he would attract the attention of the creator of the world. At this point, it could be said that he was already at a critical point. If he continued, he might be able to obtain some benefits, but the danger he needed to take was too great, and the losses outweighed the gains. Is he welcoming the fourth great tribulation? After stopping the expansion, Luo Fan began to focus his attention on the various situations in this world that he had investigated over the past few days. According to his investigations, this region was indeed as he had expected. It had already undergone the third tribulation of the world. However, compared to Luo Fan's own world of laws, which had passed through the great tribulation of heaven and earth effortlessly, this world of laws had never passed through the great tribulation of heaven and earth easily, although it wasn't to the extent that he would stumble and almost die every time. However, at the very least, after every great tribulation, a large amount of the benefits bestowed by the tribulation level would be consumed to repair the world. As a result, the world's growth from the benefits bestowed by the tribulation level did not reach its limit. Among them, the third great tribulation of the heavens and earth was the most severe. Although this world had withstood the third great tribulation of the heavens and earth and had obtained endless benefit from the tribulation layer, it was still not enough. However, almost 90% of these benefits were used to repair this world. Only the remaining 10% was used to help this world expand and strengthen. It could be said that although this world had passed through the third great tribulation of the heavens and earth, it was at least several times weaker than a normal world that had passed through the third great tribulation perfectly. Such a world was about to welcome the fourth great tribulation of the heavens and earth. The fourth great tribulation of the heavens and earth would be 10 times or even 100 times more powerful than the third great tribulation of the heavens and earth. Therefore, the creator of this world had no choice but to focus all his attention on welcoming the fourth great tribulation of the heavens and earth. After all, if the fourth great tribulation of the heavens and earth could not be passed, then this world would be completely destroyed, and everything that he had obtained so far would be lost. Even if he had some backup plans that could allow him to survive after failing to pass the great tribulation of the heavens and earth, the loss would be so great that it would be enough to turn his countless years of hard work into naught. Compared to this kind of danger, the small abnormalities and changes that had occurred in this world, even if they could shake the foundation of this world, were nothing at all. In this case, my movements may be a little bigger, Luo Fan thought as his heart turned. His purpose in entering this world this time was to try and sever the shackles that this world had on the world of laws. Through severing the shackles, he could experience the essence of the shackles and finally sever all the shackles that were attached to the world of laws. If he wanted to sever the shackles that were attached to the world of laws, then the most straightforward way would naturally be to completely destroy this world. This was something that he naturally did not dare to think about before he entered this world. After all, since this world could shackle the world of laws, it meant that it was at least a world that had passed through the third great tribulation of the heavens and earth. Compared to the world of laws, this world had obviously passed through more great tribulation of the heavens and earth. The difficulty of dealing with this world was obviously higher. He naturally could not be blindly confident in a world that was more vast and developed than the world that he had created. But now, after entering this world and using various means to deceive the creator of this world, he gradually saw through the essence of this world. He understood that this world was actually not very brilliant, and the creator of this world was not stronger than him. After understanding this point, his confidence naturally soared. He already had a considerable amount of confidence in this matter. He immediately turned his field of vision towards the tribulation levels outside the heavens and the earth. As his understanding of this world grew deeper and deeper, many existences that he couldn't see clearly before were now seen by him. It was the same for the great tribulation layer that shrouded this world. In the past, his understanding of this world was relatively shallow. Although he knew that this world was also shrouded by the Great Tribulation layer, and he could still bear the attacks of the Great Tribulation layer at any time, he couldn't see the existence of the Great Tribulation layer no matter what. He couldn't see what kind of situation the Great Tribulation layer was shrouding this world in. But now, as his understanding of the world deepened and his understanding increased, the various things that were hidden in the fog gradually revealed their true appearance. In his eyes, the Great Tribulation layer had countless Great Tribulation paths spreading out and directly connecting to this world. Vaguely, there seemed to be the power of many Great Tribulations faintly flowing through. Some surged out from the Great Tribulation layer and poured into this world, while some surged out from this world and poured into the Great Tribulation layer. Chapter 2749. This was the first time Luo Fan had discovered that the power of tribulations would move back and forth between heaven and earth and the tribulation level. At this moment, he suddenly understood why he hadn't been able to discover the worlds that had passed the third great tribulation through the tribulation level. As it turned out, the connection between tribulations that surpassed the third tribulation and the world was not the same as the previous two tribulations. It was just that the power of the tribulation would be channeled into the world unilaterally. Instead, it used a more complicated and mysterious method to communicate with the world. If it wasn't for the fact that he was in this world, and this world was already in the process of preparing for the fourth great tribulation of the world, who knows how long it would take for him to discover this. All sorts of indescribable realizations appeared in Luo Fan's heart at this moment. With this realization, his main body discovered that the sky in front of him had changed inexplicably. Strange lights and shadows appeared in the originally empty, or rather, dark space, making the already crowded starry sky even more crowded at this moment. The places where those light shadows were located were the places where the heavens and earth had at least survived the third great tribulation of the world. The reason why it was a shadow instead of a real star or a real heaven and earth was because Luo Fan had a better understanding of the connection between the tribulation and the heaven and earth above the third tribulation. Because he had realized the general nature of the connection, he understood that the connection between the two did not only involve the power of tribulations being poured into the world from the tribulation layer, but also some of the power of tribulations flowing into the tribulation layer from the world. That was why he knew about the existence of those worlds. However, because he had only established such a concept, he only knew the existence of such a form of existence. He still didn't know exactly what the rules were, what the might of the tribulations represented, what they were used for, and what profundities they possessed. So, he was unable to delve a step further. He was unable to see the heavens and the earth clearly, and he was unable to sense the existence of the heavens and the earth. This situation was like an ordinary person who clearly knew what the world looked like and what the possible structure of the world was. However, because he had never seen it with his own eyes, he had never obtained any concrete evidence to prove all of this. Therefore, the entire world that he knew was shrouded in some sort of fog, and it seemed plausible. It was also similar to what the many founders of the world and the transportation network thought of the world that Luo Fan's clone had infiltrated. Just this reward alone is worth the price of the ticket. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind when he saw the tribulation energy flowing out of the world and pouring into the tribulation layer. Just recognizing the existence of this channel had already brought him endless benefits. At the very least, with this knowledge, it was enough for him to improve his understanding of the entire simulated state of chaos, allowing the higher levels of the pyramid that were previously completely undetectable to finally have the possibility of sensing it. As long as he had the possibility of perceiving it, it would only be a matter of time before he could truly perceive the higher levels of the pyramid and turn them into something that he could comprehend. Therefore, even though his clone had been discovered by the founders of this world, he already felt that this mission was not in vain. But of course, even though he felt that it was worth the price of the ticket, it did not mean that Luo Fan had decided to give up on the goal of entering this world. At this moment, he began to focus his senses on the tribulation levels and the passageway to this world. This world was currently only welcoming the fourth great tribulation of the world, but it was not already in the midst of the great tribulation. Therefore, the tribulation energy that appeared in the channel between the tribulation layer and this world was clearly in a dormant state. In other words, it was in a state where it was subtly changing the world to prepare for the tribulation. In this state, the power of the tribulations did not directly change the world as it poured into the world. In other words, it did not directly change the main body of this world. Most of the power of the tribulations had merged with the many parallel worlds in this world in an unimaginably profound manner. For example, parallel space-time, parallel time, parallel space, parallel dimension, and so on and so forth. Although the remaining small portion was the main body that entered this world, it was also integrated into all things in the world in an unimaginably subtle way. It was integrated into a place that even the founders of this world could not sense. The founders of this world were the founders of this world and were the absolute rulers of this world. They had unimaginable authority in this world and could do countless unimaginable things. However, this did not mean that nothing in this world could be hidden from him. If there was really nothing that could be hidden from him, then how could Luo Fan's incarnation grow to this stage in this world without being discovered? He would have been wiped out a long time ago. In reality, just like how there was a limit to the senses of any living being as the creator of the world, there was also a certain limit to the senses of the world in this world. Changes that were too subtle, too scattered, or too macroscopic could not be discovered by the founders of this world. Of course, this was too subtle, and the degree of subtlety had to reach an unimaginable level. For example, the size of an atom. For the founders of this world, perhaps they had to shrink by 1,000,000,000,000 times before they could exceed the range of their senses. Similarly, situations that were too scattered and macroscopic were similar. They both had to reach a level that far exceeded the limits of the imagination of living beings in order to truly exceed the range of the founders of this world. For ordinary cultivators, it was naturally extremely difficult to hide outside the range of their senses. Even Luo Fan could not do it. However, for the tribulation levels, this seemed to be the most ordinary change. At this moment, the power of the various tribulations that the levels of the tribulations had transmitted into this world was hidden outside of the perception range of the founder of the world. It was precisely because of this that the founders of this world could only work hard to strengthen the world and arrange various arrangements in order to welcome the final eruption of the tribulation. In fact, if it was not for Luo Fan's ability to clearly sense the power transmitted from the tribulation levels and follow the flow of the power to its final destination, he might not have been able to sense where the power of the tribulation energy was hidden. After all, even the range of the founders of this world could not encompass the hidden power of the tribulation energy. Although Luo Fan was powerful, there were still various restrictions in this world. The power that he could unleash was ultimately not comparable to that of the founders of this world. Is this the hiding method of the fourth great tribulation of heaven and earth? If I want to block it, it will be countless times more troublesome than the first and second great tribulation of heaven and earth. Luo Fan looked at the hiding method of the countless tribulations and sighed in his heart. Although the first and second tribulations were also hidden in this world, the way they were hidden was not as deep as this, and they did not reach the point where the founders of this world could sense them. If the founders of this world noticed this possibility, they would still be able to sense the hidden tribulations. Yet now, the fourth tribulation of the heavens and the earth was completely different. It was actually hidden in a way that completely exceeded the scope of perception of the creator of the heavens and the earth. It was countless times more troublesome than the first and second tribulations of the heavens and the earth. If Luo Fan's goal was to help this world survive the tribulation, he would probably have to wait for the tribulation to truly erupt before he could find a way to stop it. However, it was clear that Luo Fan's goal for entering this world this time was not to do so. To him, helping the tribulation level and the power of the tribulation was what he really wanted to do. Therefore, at this moment, he did not have any thoughts of stopping the tribulation power. Instead, he began to try his best to understand the purpose of the tribulation power, and tried his best to help it achieve its goal. This seems to be changing a certain characteristic and linking everything together. In the end, when the tribulation really erupts, everything in this world will be destroyed in an instant. Although he could not really see where the tribulation power was hidden, since he had already realized its existence, he could easily deduce part of the function of the tribulation power based on the various subtle changes that occurred in the places where the tribulation power was hidden. However, although he had deduced this, he could not do anything about the situation in the main body of this world. It could be said that in the main body of this world, the tribulation power was already the limit of what it could do. Luo Fan's participation could indeed accelerate the effect of the tribulation power, but at the same time, it would also make it easier for the effects of the tribulation power to reveal itself, and it would be easier for the creator of this world to sense it. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan naturally turned his gaze to another place. Or rather, another place, the parallel place of this world. Compared to the cautiousness in the main body of this world, the tribulation power in the parallel place was even more unscrupulous. In other words, the parallel place was ultimately inferior to the main body of this world on a certain level. After entering the parallel place in the same way, the effect produced was many times greater than in the main body of this world. This kind of enlargement caused the effect that couldn't be seen in the parallel space to become much more obvious. Finally, it could be seen. Did he include the parallel place in his observation range? At this moment, a doubt appeared in Luo Fan's mind. The existence of the parallel place should not be a secret to ordinary creators of this world. Ordinary creators of this world should be able to detect the existence of the parallel place. However, it was obvious that most creators of this world would not pay too much attention to the parallel place. At least, among the creators of this world that Luo Fan knew before this, apart from himself, no other creator of this world had really tried to bring all the parallel places into their control. The world in front of him had, after all, already passed the third great tribulation of this world. The understanding and control of this world of a creator of this world should be stronger than that of other creators of this world that Luo Fan knew. Other creators of this world did not bring the parallel places into their control and did not pay attention to those parallel places, but it did not mean that the creator of this world in front of him was the same. Looks like I have to test it out. With this thought flashing in his mind, Luo Fan began to take action. Compared to ordinary creators of this world, Luo Fan, who had already brought all the parallel places of his world into his control, clearly had a deeper understanding. He could not be any clearer about how to trigger a change in a certain parallel place in the main body of a world. At this moment, he did not move at all, but a certain star world in a certain parallel space began to undergo a huge change. An indescribable vitality was born out of thin air in that star world. It began to expand wildly like a balloon. This vitality began to continuously fuse with the star world, causing the star world to undergo greater and greater changes. The originally unconscious star world that could only follow the operating rules of the countless star worlds in the starry sky began to have autonomy at this moment, and it began to struggle. This struggle gradually caused the operation of a large area of the surrounding star world to become abnormal, and it even gradually caused some kind of subtle chaos. This chaos continued to spread outwards and gradually caused a large area of the starry sky in the parallel space to become chaotic. The chaos in the starry sky had a huge impact on the world, causing the central world in the parallel space to undergo greater and greater changes, no matter how one looked at it. It seemed like the birth of a tribulation. Chapter 2750. However, the creator of the universe did not react to the changes in the parallel space. It was unknown whether he could not sense it, or if he thought that the changes were nothing. However, according to Luo Fan, perhaps it was more likely that he could not sense it. Of course, this relatively high probability might be enough for an ordinary cultivator, but for Luo Fan, it was still far from enough. Hence, at this moment, he turned his attention to the other parallel spaces and used a similar method to provoke changes in the star worlds in those parallel spaces. He began to disturb the starry sky in those parallel spaces, causing those parallel spaces to seem to have fallen into tribulations. Of course, this was not just a metaphor to a certain extent. Those parallel spaces were also filled with the power of the endless tribulations. When Luo Fan took action, the power of the tribulations began to gather towards those changing regions and began to take effect according to the changes. In turn, these changes would be incorporated into the evolution of the tribulations. Tribulations had countless possibilities and countless directions of development. The development of any tribulations would only pick out one or many of them. From a moment the tribulations lay dormant to the moment they erupted, it was equivalent to the collapse of these countless possibilities into one or many of them. What was happening in those parallel spaces now was equivalent to Luo Fan using his own methods to guide the power of the tribulations to collapse in advance. If it was said that the changes that happened in the first parallel space were small-scale and did not attract the attention of the creator of the world, then the changes that were happening in hundreds of parallel spaces could no longer be considered small-scale, no matter what perspective one looked at it from. No matter how busy the creator of the universe was, as long as he discovered these changes, he would definitely react and take corresponding actions. However, in reality, the creator of the universe did not take any action at all. At this moment, he was still hiding in the central world within the main body of the universe, carrying out all sorts of plans, arrangements, and preparations in the central world. He did not react at all to the terrifying upheaval that was happening in those parallel spaces that could completely overturn and destroy those parallel spaces. After all, Luo Fan had already reached his current realm, and he had already stepped into his seventh Great Tribulation. Whether the living beings were completely unresponsive or pretending to be unresponsive, he was still able to distinguish them. In his eyes, the creator of heaven and earth truly had no reaction whatsoever. It seems that he really doesn't know much about parallel universes. At this time, Luo Fan finally confirmed this point. After confirming that the creator of this world didn't have much knowledge about parallel worlds, there was no need to say what to do next. With a slight thought, his will began to undergo various subtle changes and began to seep into a certain parallel space bit by bit. It was not difficult to infiltrate this parallel space with his will. After all, he was already able to sense these parallel spaces. Sensing them was basically seeping his perception into them. Since his perception could seep in, he was only a step away from breaking through to willpower. This step might be difficult for the average cultivator, but for Luo Fan, it was just a matter of a thought. Silently, Luo Fan's perception had completely entered this parallel space. In this place, his will no longer needed to be restricted. At this moment, he condensed his will and formed a body of will in this parallel space. This will body looked no different from his true incarnation. It was so much so that even the strength of his body was extremely similar. The incarnation that Luo Fan had sent into this world was merely something he had created with a thought. Although Luo Fan's incarnation was considered the source of everything in this world, it was considered his true body. However, in essence, there was not much value in the incarnation. If Luo Fan really wanted to, he could create thousands of incarnations with a thought, as long as his will was willing to create them. Clearly, at this time, Luo Fan's will was willing. Although the body of will was condensed from will, it was essentially no different from the incarnation. As the willpower body formed, the many body parts that belonged to Luo Fan's incarnation in the main body of the world began to gradually lose their vitality. The willpower that originally belonged to these body parts began to act like the main body of the will and began to seep into this parallel space on their own. They began to gather towards this body. Whether it was the body parts that had awakened or the body that was still seeking to awaken, it was all the same. With this change, it didn't take long for all the will that belonged to Luo Fan's incarnation to completely leave the main body of the world and enter this parallel space, gathering in the body of the will. In the main body of the world, all the body parts didn't seem to have changed on the surface, but they had become simple combinations of matter and had nothing to do with Luo Fan. This appearance was like the difference between a person and a corpse. When the body parts originally possessed Luo Fan's will, they were like living people. But now they had become corpses. As corpses, their resistance to the environment was relatively weak. It didn't take long for the body parts to be completely assimilated by the surroundings, disintegrated, and fused. In the end, they could no longer be found. The speed of the assimilation varied, but even the slowest one only took a few days to complete. After all, no matter what, Luo Fan's incarnation was an external object. The entry of these body parts had even attracted the attention of the creator of the world. It must be known that as the creator of the world, who was preparing to face the fourth great tribulation of the world, he was unimaginably busy. But even so, he could sense something when Luo Fan's body parts entered this world, and he could even vaguely lock onto the existence of the world of stars. This was enough to show how sudden this change was and how much of a conflict it had with the world itself. This conflict was originally suppressed by Luo Fan's will, which allowed his body parts to exist freely in those worlds and not be completely devoured. But now, Luo Fans will have been completely extracted, and these body parts have become pure substances that were in conflict with this world. So, how could they withstand this kind of conflict? Luo Fan naturally didn't care about the fate of these body parts. At the end of the day, he had only created these substances with a single thought. The reason why he had cared about them before was because these body parts carried a part of his will. If he lost them, his will would be lost, and his will would no longer be complete. Now that his will had become complete, he no longer needed these body parts to carry it. These body parts no longer had any special meaning to him. At this moment, in the parallel space, Luo Fan's figure flashed and directly stepped into the central world of this parallel space. Although he had seen the center world from afar, Luo Fan didn't dare to directly investigate the main body of the world because the creator of the world was present. In the end, he could only vaguely sense the situation of the center world. He still didn't know what the central world looked like or what special characteristics it had. Although he was currently in a parallel space, the parallel space he had specially chosen was actually very little different from the main body of the world. The true difference between the two was merely the different directions of evolution that had occurred hundreds of years ago. To ordinary beings, the influence of a certain change that had occurred hundreds of years ago was enough to turn the world upside down and turn this parallel space into a state that ordinary beings couldn't even imagine. However, to the world itself, this kind of change was really insignificant. It could be said that everything obtained in this parallel space could be substituted into the main body of the world at will. Even if some things couldn't be directly substituted, it would be extremely easy to deduce them. It would probably only take a small change to do so. The main body of the world was also a vast world with a round sky and a square earth. This world was so vast that it was tens of thousands of times larger than any of the planets that Luo Fan had ever known. The number of living beings in this world was unimaginable. Just the kingdoms formed by intelligent beings would probably need to be counted in the trillions. Among these kingdoms, the number of living beings in each kingdom would also need to be counted in the trillions. Just like that, the number of living beings in this world added up to an inconceivable number, and it was easy to imagine. In this world, the countless kingdoms revolved around a sacred mountain in the center. In terms of absolute size, this sacred mountain couldn't even compare to any famous mountain in any kingdom. But it was this sacred mountain that was enough to shock anyone. No matter which corner of the world they were in, they could even see the existence of this sacred mountain from the sky when they looked up. The creator of the world was on this sacred mountain. Of course, it was on this sacred mountain in the main body of the world. For this parallel space, although the sacred mountain still existed, the creator of the world was no longer there. Moreover, compared to the living beings in the main body of the world who could still see the sacred mountain within a certain range, there were no living beings or existences in this parallel space that could see the sacred mountain from any location, let alone step into it. For all the living beings in this parallel space, the sacred mountain only existed in an illusion. It existed in the legendary heavenly realm, the residence of the legendary gods. In fact, as long as there were some rational living beings, they would treat its existence as a legend. At least, this had been the case for the past hundreds of years. In the legends, the sacred mountain didn't seem to be like this hundreds of years ago. There seemed to be some existences that could step into the sacred mountain and even become the disciple of the god on the sacred mountain. Luo Fan was well aware of all this. He knew that this was because this parallel space had been separated from the main body of the world since hundreds of years ago. Hundreds of years ago, everything that happened in this parallel space was actually everything that happened in the main body of the world. All the history of the past hundreds of years was also the history of the main body of the world. At that time, The sacred mountain naturally still had the same structure as the main body of the world, and it also existed in the same form as the main body of the world. Hundreds of years ago, as the parallel space split apart, or rather, as it was truly born, the sacred mountain and the creator of the world on it remained in the main body of the world and didn't split apart along with the parallel space. Naturally, it was impossible to truly come into contact with the silhouette of the sacred mountain and the deity on the sacred mountain. Seeing this, Luo Fan only smiled. With a flash, he arrived at the original location of the sacred mountain. This was the center of this world. In the past, the sacred mountain existed here and projected its figure to every region of this world through the laws of the world. But now, there was only an empty space left. An empty space that normal living beings could not touch or even see. As for the sacred mountain that was still projected to every region of this world, it was only a remnant of the previous laws. In other words, what it projected was actually the last scene of the sacred mountain before it disappeared. Moreover, as time passed, this remnant would become fainter and finally disappear completely at a certain moment. When Luo Fan appeared here, a thought flashed through his mind. Soon, he smiled and made a grabbing motion in the void. Endless matter and power appeared out of thin air and began to quickly fill the empty space where he was at. He began to use his own method to construct space-time here and condense a mountain that looked like the sacred mountain. Chapter 2751. Of course, simply condensing the sacred mountain wasn't enough to completely replace the sacred mountain's position in this world, and this parallel space. After all, the reason why the sacred mountain could be seen from any location in the central world, become the core of the central world, and influence every inch of space in this world was because of the sacred mountain's relationship with this world, the laws of this world, and the space-time of this world. Without the assistance of so many relationships, if he simply condensed the appearance of the sacred mountain, even though it contained some wonders and special mysteries, it would just be a rather peculiar mountain. It wouldn't be enough to become the core of this world. Therefore, although he had condensed the sacred mountain, he still had a lot of work to do to achieve Luo Fan's goal. If an ordinary cultivator came to this step, they would probably be at a complete loss and not know what to do at all. However, it was obvious that for Luo Fan, what happened next was just a matter of course. At that moment, he had a thought. The sacred mountain started to tremble slightly, and it started to indescribably engulf the outside world. This engulfment targeted the laws of this world, time, space, matter, and energy. It also targeted the central world's world, the world will. This world seemed to be very complete, as if it had a history of countless trillions of years. However, it had only been born a few centuries ago. It had only been born the moment this parallel space split apart. As a world that had only been born a few centuries ago, the world will of this world was clearly still in a state of brewing. In this state, it was relatively easy for the world will to be mobilized. Even though Luo Fan had been prepared to face strong resistance from the engulfment and had even been prepared to completely suppress it, the world will's world will resist it strongly. However, in the end, none of his preparations were effective. The engulfment was unimaginably smooth. In fact, not only did the world will not resist, but it even took the initiative to approach the sacred mountain like a shark that smelled blood. The original engulfment was to keep as many things from the outside world in the sacred mountain as possible. However, following the change in the behavior of the will of the world, this swallowing and spitting had completely reversed. It had turned into doing its best to expel the power of the will of the world. It felt like the sacred mountain had already been treated by the world will as its home, its lair. It turned out that the reason why it left was because this lair, this home, had been destroyed. Now that the sacred mountain had taken shape, it was like its home. Its nest had been rebuilt. With regards to this, Luo Fan only needed to think for a moment before he understood what was going on. It seemed that the will of the central world had always resided within the sacred mountain, or rather, the main body of the world. The tentacles that extended out were at most a derivative of the will of the world. With this in mind, he naturally knew what to do next. In that instant, his heart stirred slightly. The sacred mountain trembled slightly, and the originally indiscriminate devouring power that targeted everything in the outside world began to change. Various devouring mechanisms that targeted the laws of nature, time, space, cause and effect, fate, luck, the will of the world, and so on and so forth. Everything was separated. In the blink of an eye, thousands of different engulfment mechanisms appeared on the sacred mountain. The corresponding existences seemed to have entered different dimensions, constantly engulfing the sacred mountain in a manner that did not interfere with each other. With this change, the engulfment that originally targeted the will of the world, but instead pushed the will of the world outwards, changed into a different form. It turned into a gale that frantically sucked in the will of the world and absorbed it. In just a few short days, the will of the world and the entire central world had completely surged into the sacred mountain. It was as if it had returned to its nest and became extremely calm, causing the essence of the sacred mountain to undergo the most important change. In an instant, the sacred mountain that all living beings could see when they raised their heads in various parts of the central world had unknowingly become blurry. This wasn't because the traces of the sacred mountain were fading as they had originally seen. Instead, what they saw was no longer the original marks. Instead, it had become a new sacred mountain. The reason why the new sacred mountain was blurry and difficult to see through was actually relatively simple. The connection between the sacred mountain and the world wasn't that tight. This loose connection allowed the sacred mountain to possess some of the original special effects of the sacred mountain, but it couldn't fully unleash those special effects. As a result, the special effects hover between existence and non-existence. As a result, the sacred mountain in the sky that everyone could see became blurry at this moment. Everyone naturally began to panic in the face of such a situation. It should be noted that the sacred mountain hadn't changed in countless years as far as they could remember. No matter what this unprecedented change meant, all living beings would definitely be alarmed. What's going on? Why has the sacred mountain suddenly become blurry? Could it be that God has abandoned us? Many creatures with faith were terrified. There were cultivators in this world as well. However, the cultivation path that the cultivators here took wasn't the one that Luo Fan was familiar with. It wasn't the cultivation system that could be unified in most large worlds. Instead, it was a completely new cultivation system that he was completely unfamiliar with. In fact, he couldn't even compare it to the cultivation system that he was familiar with. This cultivation system was absolutely independent. It was a complete system of its own and completely compatible with the living beings in this world, and only the living beings in this world. The absolute independence of this cultivation system naturally didn't mean that no other living beings could cultivate it. In fact, for cultivators, there was nothing impossible. However, there was only one possibility for foreign cultivators to cultivate this cultivation system. They had to transform themselves into the form of a living being. Only by transforming themselves into such a form could they truly grasp the basics of this cultivation system. Moreover, they could also take a step further and continuously advance the cultivation system. For this cultivation system, what they pursued was not the ultimate immortality and indestructibility. Instead, they wanted to become one with the world. They wanted to entrust their everything to the world and ultimately help the world grow further. If they followed this cultivation system to the end, they would turn into a star. That's right, it was none other than one of the countless star worlds that could be seen when one looked up at the sky. It wasn't like other worlds that turned into stars, where ones would directly fuse with it. In this world, after a cultivator cultivated into a star world, the world didn't fuse with it at all. Instead, it was directly extracted and sent into the next cycle of reincarnation to begin the next round of cultivation. The star world began to circulate in the starry sky according to the laws of this world. It was like a natural star world. Of course, to be more precise, it was like the countless star worlds that had been born since ancient times. However, this cultivation system wasn't really that harsh on cultivators. After countless years of cultivation and turning into a star world, it wasn't that the cultivator didn't really gain any benefits. After turning their original body into a star world, the cultivator's life essence would receive a fundamental upgrade. For example, if an ordinary living being transformed its body into a world of stars, its life essence would rise to another level and become a transcendent. If he were to continue training now, he would transform into a world of stars again, and his life essence would become that of a legendary. After that, it would be demigods, gods, and so on and so forth until the final stage, eternal immortality. Of course, from an ordinary being to an eternal being, there are 81 stages in between. If one wanted to go through all these stages one by one would need to turn one's body into a star world 81 times at least, from ancient times to the present, at least in the memories of all living beings and the records of many cultivators. The number of cultivators who had truly completed this entire process could be counted on one hand. And these cultivators were all disciples of the gods of the sacred mountain. They had long disappeared without a trace, along with the disappearance of the sacred mountain. Of course, this was also the greatest characteristic of this world. That was, even if one's life essence was enhanced to the eternal immortal realm, the strength that one possessed was still rather limited. This kind of life essence could only be expressed in many other aspects. In terms of destructive power, or in other words, the supremacy of true strength didn't have much of an effect. Perhaps after improving one's life essence, one could become untainted by dust, achieve anything one wished for, receive boundless blessings from Providence at all times, understand everything one needed to understand, and so on and so forth. One could achieve almost everything one could think of. However, if he wanted to destroy the world, he should not even think about it. If one truly exerted their strength, perhaps they could indeed cause damage to a certain area, producing effects that would be considered earth-shattering in the eyes of ordinary living beings. But in reality, no matter what, these damages wouldn't affect the true safety of the world. Moreover, once the power was extracted, the overly exaggerated changes would be erased, rendering the excessively exaggerated damages completely ineffective. Even though Luo Fan had seen so many lands and worlds, this was the first time he had seen such a cultivation system. How on earth did they create such a cultivation system? When Luo Fan had the time to sense the cultivation system of this world, he couldn't help but sigh inwardly. This kind of cultivation system was rather complete and clearly wasn't something that could be created in a flash. There had to be a source for it. The greatest possibility was that the creator of this world had seen this cultivation system somewhere and experienced its benefits. Only then would he be able to integrate this cultivation system into his own worldview. This was actually very easy to understand because he believed that this kind of cultivation system was the most perfect, and because he believed that this kind of cultivation system was the most sustainable. Therefore, when he organized his worldview, he would naturally incorporate the concept of this cultivation system into it. He believed that a perfect world, a perfect heaven and earth, then the cultivation system should be like this. And once he had this understanding, then the cultivation system that prevailed in the world he created could only be this kind of cultivation system. 72 creations of worlds. Looks like this is the limit for ordinary living beings. After sensing slightly, Luo Fan knew the level of the most powerful cultivator in this parallel space at this moment. In this parallel space, there were almost endless living beings. Among so many living beings, the number of cultivators was also unbelievably high. The distribution of these living beings was also different from other worlds. They weren't separated from the mortal world, and they didn't belong to an orthodox cultivation world. Instead, all the cultivators had integrated into the mortal society in an extremely natural way. They carried out all sorts of activities along with the evolution of the mortal world. Although they were slightly different from the living beings in the mortal world, they weren't incompatible. On the contrary, they were like geniuses among the mortal beings who stood at the peak of the mortal world. It could even be said that the entire mortal world was actually under their control. And among these cultivators, the most powerful cultivator was the one who had experienced 72 creations of worlds. There were already 72 planets in the sky that were created by this cultivator. Moreover, there were quite a number of such cultivators. Although there was only one expert who had raised their cultivation base to this level in the hundreds of millions of countries in the Central World, it was easy to imagine the terrifying number of such cultivators in the Central World. However, if one thought about the trillions of countries in the Central World, one could imagine how terrifying the number of such cultivators in the Central World was. There were so many cultivators who had created 72 star realms, but none of them had created more than 72 star realms. There was only one possibility for this. That was in this parallel space, the strongest cultivator that could exist was only at this level. Cultivators who surpassed this level either had to meet special conditions or couldn't stay in this parallel space. Chapter 2752. Luo Fan's main objective in entering this world was to destroy it. To him, the restrictions of this world and the things that he wanted to avoid were things that he could do something about. At this moment, the existence of the realm restriction of the cultivators in this parallel space was a clear starting point for him. However, it was clear that he could only put this matter aside for now. Right now, the most important thing for him was to complete the construction of the sacred mountain and complete his absolute control over the Central World. Hence, he focused more of his efforts on the connection between the sacred mountain and the Central World. He began to establish connections bit by bit so that the sacred mountain would gradually replace the sacred mountain's original position. As more and more connections were made, the blurry silhouette of the sacred mountain that could be seen everywhere in the Central World gradually became clearer. A supreme majesty that had not been felt for hundreds of years from the sacred mountain began to envelop heaven and earth once again. In the face of this change, the worries in everyone's hearts began to gradually fade. Although they did not know what had happened to the sacred mountain, from the looks of it, the abnormalities that had occurred on the sacred mountain should have already been restored. Although the connection between the sacred mountain and the Central World, or rather, the connection between the sacred mountain and this parallel space, was extremely complicated, it was actually quite fast. In just a few short days, everything that could be connected between the sacred mountain and this parallel space was completely connected. When the sacred mountain was connected to everything, it seemed to instantly become the core of this parallel space. Every inhalation and exhalation of a sacred mountain would cause the most fundamental changes in the parallel space. Whether it was the energy, laws, or even the more mystical and mysterious aspects of the parallel space, all of them underwent indescribable changes at this moment. Luo Fan's clone had already appeared on the peak of the sacred mountain. There was a group of buildings there. It was a group of buildings that looked extremely ordinary and ordinary. However, if any cultivator from a parallel space were to come here, they would definitely feel the countless inconceivable mysteries contained in this building complex. Every single brick and tile of the building seemed to be derived from a grand Tao, and it was as profound as the materialization of the world. Any cultivator that possessed the slightest bit of foundation in cultivation would definitely be able to sense the principles they required from it. The scene on the sacred mountain was naturally not constructed by Luo Fan out of thin air, although this was not difficult for him. Everything here, even the tiniest bit of sand and gravel, was actually constructed according to the light and shadow of the sacred mountain that he had left behind. In other words, everything here was actually everything that was originally on the sacred mountain, whether it was the buildings on the summit of the holy mountain or any of the lines on the other mountains. It was the same. With a thought, Luo Fan arrived at the center of the complex with a sway of his figure. It was the most mysterious and noble building that was specially built for the creator of this world. Or rather, it was the main hall. The structure of the hall was rather exquisite. Although its style was completely different from all the halls that Luo Fan had seen in the past, it was equally dignified, noble, and awe-inspiring. The creator of this world clearly did not have a humanoid appearance like Luo Fan. Instead, it had an extremely strange appearance. Although it had 4 limbs, no one would treat it as a normal living being. It was an extremely distorted appearance. Of course, this was only from Luo Fan's own aesthetic standards. If one were to look at it from the aesthetic point of view of the living beings in this world, it was clear that the extremely distorted appearance of the 4 limbs was not an ugly appearance. Instead, it had all sorts of indescribable characteristics, causing these distortions to contain a certain beauty that Luo Fan could not understand. Of course, if one were to remove the influence of aesthetic standards, this kind of body structure was indeed somewhat beautiful to a certain extent. After all, it was the appearance of a born Taoist body of a world. It was naturally self-consistent, and it also contained all kinds of mysteries of the world. As long as such an existence was not absolutely anti-society or anti-world, anyone would find it to contain a certain sense of beauty. However, if one's aesthetic standards were different, they would only keep a respectful distance from it. The different structure resulted in the construction methods and styles of this world being vastly different from the various construction methods and styles that Luo Fan understood. For example, this should theoretically be the most important place in the entire central world for the creator of this world. However, Luo Fan felt very uncomfortable entering it. Even though he was sitting on the largest throne in this hall, it was still the same. Looks like I need to make some changes. Although he already knew this, Luo Fan could not help but say this when he truly felt the awkwardness of the throne. Previously, in order to perfectly accept the authority of this parallel space, he could only reconstruct the sacred mountain according to its original appearance. Even though it was clearly an anti-human design, he could only do so. However, now that he had completely grasped the central world and the highest authority of this parallel space, he no longer had to worry about the original creator of this world appearance. He could change it to whatever he wanted. At this moment, with just a slight movement of his heart, the throne beneath him began to squirm. In the blink of an eye, it had completely changed into another form that completely matched Luo Fan's body. Not only did it not make him feel the slightest bit uncomfortable, but it also made him feel extremely comfortable. Then, the various structures within the hall began to change as well. They also turned into a structure that suited his aesthetic standards. Once the structure was completely changed, Luo Fan finally felt a little more comfortable. At this moment, his brows twitched. He suddenly sensed that many cultivators were crossing the boundary of the sacred mountain from all directions. They were heading towards the sacred mountain. The sacred mountain was the core of the central world and the core of this parallel space. As such a core, it naturally could not be like a public toilet, where people could come and go as they pleased. The reason why there were cultivators entering and approaching the sacred mountain not long after he established, it was none other than the fact that the sacred mountain didn't exist in the past several hundred years. As a sacred mountain, it was naturally impossible for it to be built here just for the masses to admire it. The sacred mountain naturally had its purpose here. There's also a certain mechanism to guide living beings from the outside world into the sacred mountain to fulfill its original function. When Luo Fan built the sacred mountain previously, he had also retained this mechanism. The cultivators that had entered the sacred mountain were clearly the ones that fulfilled the original guiding mechanism of the sacred mountain. As for why so many of them had arrived so quickly, it was naturally because it had been accumulated over hundreds of years. The cultivators that had originally met the conditions to enter the sacred mountain had long gathered outside the sacred mountain in the past hundreds of years, working hard to find a way to enter the sacred mountain. However, because the sacred mountain had not existed for hundreds of years, all of their efforts could only be in vain. Since they could not enter the sacred mountain, they naturally would not leave. Instead, they would stay around the sacred mountain. As such, after hundreds of years, a considerable number of cultivators that were qualified to enter the sacred mountain had naturally gathered here. To these cultivators, the only thing that prevented them from entering the sacred mountain was the fact that the sacred mountain did not exist. Under such circumstances, the the sacred mountain had suddenly appeared, so of course they could enter it as soon as possible. In fact, it could even be said that they had waited until now to enter the sacred mountain because they had been too cautious and spent too much time investigating. Just in time, with that thought in mind, Luo Fan revealed a smile. The sacred mountain has finally opened. It has been 700 years. I have waited for 700 years. If the sacred mountain still doesn't open, I'm afraid I won't be able to wait for this lifetime. A cultivator looked at the sacred mountain that was faintly discernible in the mist and murmured. He was a cultivator who had created 72 celestial worlds. To him, this was already his 73rd life. To the cultivators of this world, every reincarnation was a lifetime. Every time they created a star realm, they would have to reincarnate once. In other words, every creation of a star realm was equivalent to the completion of a lifetime. Generally speaking, as long as a cultivator created a star realm, it would be equivalent to barely breaking free from the samsara of life and death. The reason why it was said to be barely breaking free and not completely breaking free was because it was only their will that broke free from the samsara of life and death. However, their bodies were still affected by the samsara of life and death, so they still had a certain lifespan. They could not break free from life and death like their will and live for a long time. Of course, compared to ordinary living beings, once a cultivator created a star realm, their lifespan would undergo a huge leap. They would not really fall to the level of ordinary living beings who would reach the limit of their lifespan in 100 to 200 years. At the very least, they would have a lifespan of 1,000 to 2,000 years. Moreover, as the number of star realms increased, the lifespan would also increase continuously. However, there was a limit to this kind of increase. Unless one could reach the eternal immortal realm and create 81 star realms, even if one cultivated to the realm of creating 80 star realms, they would only be able to live for about 100,000 years. It was not strange for such a situation to appear in a small kiliacosm. After all, the grade of a small kiliacosm determined that its endurance would not be too strong and that it would not have a high tolerance for longevity. However, it was already quite unbelievable for a world that had already gone through 3 major tribulations. After all, the endurance of such a world for immortals was not something that ordinary worlds could compare to. Not to mention living beings with longevity. Even powerhouses who had entered the tribulation stage were completely insignificant to this world. The more, the better. However, it was such a world that a cultivation system that could only allow one to live forever had appeared. No matter how one looked at it, it was incomprehensible. However, for Luo Fan, this was not surprising at all. This restriction could only be attributed to the understanding of the creator of this world towards cultivation being different from others. The cultivation system of this world was naturally not difficult for Luo Fan. He only needed to think about it, and he could instantly understand the various aspects of the cultivation method. He could even grasp the essence of the cultivation method. Although the cultivation method had endless wonderful uses and could even create star realms one after another, in fact, it did not have much support for longevity. In other words, the creator of this world did not have much support for longevity. From the understanding of the creator of this world, longevity was clearly not beneficial to the world. This kind of understanding was so deeply rooted that when he finally opened up this world, he also infused this concept into this world, causing the world to automatically lean towards this point. In fact, according to the creator of this world, no matter how powerful the living beings in this world were, their lifespans should not exceed a certain limit. However, it was too difficult to create a star realm. If one did not have enough lifespan, it would be extremely rare for a cultivator to be able to learn the basics. It would not be beneficial to the world at all. Therefore, he opened up a gap in the cultivation method, allowing living beings to use various methods to obtain more time to cultivate between each reincarnation. As for the final immortality, it was not given by the creator of this world. Instead, it was formed after the gap developed continuously and was finally grasped by that cultivator. Such an eternal existence could be said to go against the will of the creator of this world. Perhaps it was because of this that it was so difficult for cultivators to make breakthroughs in their cultivation and create 81 worlds in this parallel space. Chapter 2753. What the creator of the universe wanted was for Luo Fan to focus on. If it's immortality, it seems that I only need to modify it a little. Perhaps I should start passing down the true path of immortality in this world. Luo Fan looked at the cultivators who were slowly approaching the holy mountain from afar, and a faint smile appeared on his face. The path of immortality was an unbelievably great achievement for ordinary living beings. In fact, most ordinary living beings were willing to pay a certain price that they normally would not be willing to lose. However, for Luo Fan, the so-called path of immortality was just that. Billions of years ago, he had already surpassed the limits of mortals and obtained immortality. Now, what he pursued was immortality and indestructibility that surpassed everything. To someone like him, immortality could be said to be just a small step at the very beginning. Looking down from a perspective that was countless times higher, it was clear at a glance what the key to immortality was. Although the cultivation system in this world was complicated and mysterious, and even used creation as a transit node, everything related to immortality was extremely crude in his eyes. This crude structure meant that there were countless areas that could be modified. It also meant that there were countless ways for this cultivation system to truly involve immortality. As he watched, the cultivators finally overcome all obstacles and truly set foot on the sacred mountain. We're finally here. The cultivators all had tears streaming down their faces as they knelt at the foot of the mountain. They looked at the supreme sacred mountain that they had been looking forward to for countless years with an incomparable reverence in their eyes. For many cultivators, every blade of grass, every tree, every grain of sand, every stone, and even the lines and contours of the mountain contained endless principles and mysteries of cultivation. With just a glance, they could feel the endless mysteries pouring into their hearts in an unending stream. For these cultivators who had been stuck in the 72 planets, for who knew how many reincarnations, this feeling of progress that they hadn't felt for a long time made them feel extremely touched. They no longer felt the slightest bit of heartache for the price they had paid to come to the sacred mountain. Since Luo Fan had already decided to spread the path of immortality and make this parallel space go against the fundamental worldview of this world, he naturally would not sit by and watch anymore. At that moment, his heart moved slightly, and the sacred mountain began to undergo subtle changes. It was as if a gentle breeze suddenly blew past the sacred mountain, changing the positions of the sand and stones on the sacred mountain slightly, causing the form of the grass and trees on the sacred mountain to undergo a subtle change. In just an instant, the extremely rich charm of the path of immortality had been integrated into the sacred mountain. Even if an ordinary living being without intelligence saw the sacred mountain, they would definitely instinctively absorb the charm of immortality from it. As a result, their cultivation realm would increase bit by bit, and they would finally truly step onto the path of immortality. They would continuously advance towards immortality and finally obtain immortality, something that only an extremely small number of living beings in this world could obtain. The cultivators who could overcome countless difficulties to arrive at the sacred mountain were clearly the cultivators who stood at the peak of this world. Such a cultivator's aptitude was many times greater than that of a creature without intelligence. It was simply impossible to measure with numbers. Normally, such living beings would definitely feel extremely touched the moment they saw the sacred mountain that already contained the rich path of immortality. It was not impossible for them to surpass countless difficulties and obtain immortality in an instant. However, at this moment, the development of the situation somewhat exceeded Luo Fan's expectations. The cultivators were still touched when they saw the sacred mountain, and they constantly sensed the information and mysteries that the sacred mountain contained, which were extremely beneficial to their cultivation. However, They did not sense the path of immortality that Luo Fan really wanted to impart to them. It was as if the sacred mountain was just the sacred mountain from the beginning, which was only beneficial to their cultivation and did not contain any path of immortality at all. What kind of mechanism is this? Doubts flashed across Luo Fan's mind when he saw this. There was nothing wrong with his arrangements. He was rather confident about this. It was definitely not difficult for him to attach the path of immortality to something. He definitely would not make a mistake at this step. His confidence would definitely not be shaken by the reactions of other living beings. Even if these cultivators should have comprehended many paths of immortality the moment they encountered the information, they still did not. He was rather confident that there was only one possibility if those living beings did not sense the path of immortality. There was something wrong with them. The greatest possibility of this problem was that there was some kind of mechanism that acted on their consciousness. This mechanism limited their observation of the path of immortality and prevented them from working hard in this direction. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan immediately came to a realization. He understood why there were so many living beings, so many cultivators, and so many long histories in this world, yet no path of immortality had been born. It must be noted that the Central World's nations alone were counted in the trillions. In every country, there would need to be at least trillions of people to be counted. With so many living beings, there would definitely be countless geniuses born, even if the world did not have a long history. If there were really no restrictions, the path of immortality would definitely be found in an extremely short period of time, no matter how difficult it was to find it. Moreover, this world's history was not short. It would take at least hundreds of millions of years to survive the three great tribulations of heaven and earth with such a long history. The number of living beings that had appeared in this world would definitely multiply countless times. With so many living beings, based on probability, it was even more likely that the path of immortality that was originally hidden would be found. However, in reality, this did not happen. This clearly went against the most basic principle of probability. However, if there was some kind of mechanism that prevented the living beings in this world from coming into contact with the path of immortality and preventing cultivators from obtaining immortality, then everything would make sense. Let me take a look. Luo Fan's heart moved, and in an instant, time and space stagnated. The cultivators at the foot of the mountain had completely lost their perception of everything. Whether it was time, space, or their own bodies, they were all the same. In that instant, it was as if they had turned into inanimate objects. It was as if only their bodies were left. Soon after, these living beings appeared in front of him in a flash. Luo Fan cried out softly, "Open!" As he cried out, the cultivators instantly disintegrated. They turned from complete cultivators into scattered dust. Like smoke, they stopped moving in front of Luo Fan. Then, with a thought, Luo Fan raised his hand and waved it. The smoke began to flow and change, revealing some details. The smoke was naturally not just formed from the bodies of the cultivators. In reality, the smoke contained everything of the cultivators. Whether it was their bodies, souls, or their own power, or even the various subtle powers produced by the cultivation system of this world, they were all broken down by a spiritual power and turned into this smoke-like form. At this moment, when he searched through the smoke, it was equivalent to directly searching through all the secrets of these cultivators, whether they were hidden or revealed. I see. It's actually a complete rejection. As he searched through the smoke, he finally found an extremely fine bit of smoke. This bit of smoke came from this world, or rather from this parallel space from this world. Although it looked incomparably small, its interior already contained everything in this world, everything in this parallel space, everything in this world. It was so complicated that Luo Fan could not help but feel inexplicably shocked. After all, this was only the body of a living being, and how many living beings were there in this world? If every living being had this kind of smoke and such details in their bodies, how much work would it take? Every living being's body contains everything in this world. Is this one point of view of his worldview? Looking at this bit of smoke, Luo Fan vaguely guessed a certain concept of the creator of this world. The mysteriousness of this bit of smoke was enough to make any living being in this part of the world possess a potential comparable to this part of the world. In other words, if that living being truly made full use of this bit of smoke and fully unleashed its potential, it would definitely be able to grow to the same level as this world. Of course, if that living being wanted to truly wrestle with this world, it would require a lot of effort. No wonder they can casually create star worlds. So it turns out that they have this kind of template in their bodies. At this moment, Luo Fan also understood the source of the cultivation system of the living beings in this world. There were thousands of ways to create a star world, and in this world, every living being clearly had their own unique techniques to create a star world. The star worlds that were created also had their own unique characteristics. However, all of this actually had a root cause, and that was the existence of the smoke hidden within their bodies. It was precisely because this bit of smoke contained all the mysteries of the world that they would be constantly affected, and they would instinctively absorb the information and nutrients that they needed to create a world from it. Through this absorption, the various flaws in the birth of a star world were made up, allowing the star world to take shape again and again. However, it was also because of the existence of this bit of smoke that the living beings in this world were constantly affected. Unknowingly, they could only sense the various principles and mysteries in the smoke. Once the principles and mysteries that were not in the smoke entered their minds, they would immediately be dispersed by the many principles and mysteries contained in the smoke, no matter what method they used. Obviously, even though this world was all-encompassing and contained boundless principles and mysteries, it did not contain a single thing, the path of longevity. To the creator of this world, the great path of longevity was clearly something that should not exist in a perfect world. In his opinion, the existence of such a great path could only cause destruction to the world. It could only cause the world's development to become more and more unhealthy, and in the end, the world would unknowingly decline. In fact, Luo Fan even suspected that his home and his memories might have become extremely terrible because of the existence of the great path of longevity, and it might even be destroyed because of it. If that was not the case, he would not have such an opinion. There was no great path of longevity in this world, so there was naturally no great path of longevity in the smoke. Under such circumstances, it was only natural that Luo Fan's great path of longevity was ignored by these cultivators and had no effect on them. I didn't expect there to be an unexpected gain. As expected, this is a breakthrough. Luo Fan carefully sensed it, and a faint smile appeared on his face. After learning where the rejection of longevity came from, Luo Fan already knew how to cause even greater damage to this world. Passing down the great path of longevity to the living beings in this world would indeed cause a great impact on this world. However, the impact might fall on an empty spot, and it might not cause too serious an effect. In comparison, the flaw he had found now would definitely lead to serious consequences. The flaw was clearly the bit of smoke that contained all the mysteries of the world in his hand. The bit of smoke was simply too great. If the living beings could really make full use of it, they would definitely grow to an unbelievable level in the end. This was a good thing for the living beings. However, from another point of view, because the smoke was so majestic, its connection with the world around it was too close. Due to the closeness of the smoke, it was able to affect the entire world through this bit of smoke. The impact might not be great for a single living being or a single cultivator. However, if the number of living beings and cultivators increased, the impact would probably be enough to overturn the entire world. For example, injecting the great path of longevity into this world seemed like a good choice. When he thought of the possible outcomes, Luo Fan was full of motivation. Chapter 2754. At that moment, Luo Fan's heart moved slightly, and the speck of dust quickly enlarged in his eyes. The endless truths and mysteries that originally existed within the speck of dust began to rapidly enlarge at this moment. All sorts of details that were originally impossible to distinguish were instantly revealed at this moment. It's not an independent entity, but some sort of projection. After carefully distinguishing it, he had a deeper understanding of the speck of dust, and he understood the fundamental nature of the speck of dust. This speck of dust was only a projection, and its source was ultimately something from the outside world. And this existence from the outside world was very likely to be this world. After all, this speck of dust contained all the principles and profundities of this world. If such an existence was a projection of something else, it would be difficult to explain it. But if it was a projection of this world, then all problems would be easily solved. However, this kind of essence would not obstruct what Luo Fan wanted to do. At this moment, his heart moved slightly. Countless thoughts flashed through his mind. Very soon, a technique that was extremely closely integrated with the speck of dust in front of him, and it could even be said that it was completely created for this speck of dust, appeared in his mind. This should be enough. With this thought, he waved his hand, and the speck of dust returned to the speck of dust that the cultivator had turned into. Immediately afterward, the speck of dust that the cultivator had turned into quickly condensed, and in the blink of an eye, it had returned to its original appearance. Immediately afterward, the speck of dust that the other cultivators had turned into also underwent a similar change, and in the blink of an eye, it had completely returned to its original appearance. Of course, this kind of appearance did not conform to Luo Fan's aesthetics at all. After these cultivators had recovered, Luo Fan did not stop moving. Instead, he pointed at the cultivators in front of him and directly poured the technique that he had previously created, which was specifically targeted at the speck of dust, into their hearts. Following this change, the bodies of the cultivators trembled slightly. Even though their bodies were in a state where time and space were frozen, they seemed to have sensed it. Let's see how the effect is. With this thought in mind, Luo Fan waved his hand again, and the cultivators arrived at the foot of the sacred mountain in a flash. They appeared at the place where they had appeared at the very beginning. As they returned to their original positions, the restriction that Luo Fan had imposed on them, the restriction that froze time and space, was completely relaxed. The cultivators instantly regained their consciousness. I feel like I've comprehended something. Then, the cultivators' eyes flashed with an indescribable sense of surprise. Although their bodies and souls had been dismantled by Luo Fan during the whole process, in fact, they didn't feel anything at all during the process. He didn't even feel the passage of time. To them, they had always been here, watching the sacred mountain in front of them. They had always been comprehending the indescribable principles and mysteries of the sacred mountain. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan, who was watching from afar, only smiled faintly. At this moment, the cultivation technique that Luo Fan had specially imparted into their minds appeared in the cultivators' minds at the same time. They couldn't find the source of this cultivation technique at all. It felt as if they hadn't obtained this magic art a moment ago. But in the next moment, they didn't even feel dazed, and this magic art had already appeared in their hearts. It was so sudden, yet so natural. It was extremely strange, so they could only treat it as a gift from the sacred mountain. The cultivators looked at each other and noticed the subtle changes in each other. They had a guess in their hearts that everyone might have gained something. However, although they had cooperated for a long time along the way, they were still competitors at the end of the day. At this moment, they didn't have much intention of communicating. All of them began to diligently study the cultivation technique. This cultivation technique was extremely mysterious. It seemed like it needed to calculate an extremely hidden door in one's body and then close the door. After the door was closed, according to the cultivation technique, one would be able to see a completely different world. They had absolute trust in this cultivation technique that they obtained from the sacred mountain. Even though this cultivation technique was somewhat different from the normal cultivation technique that they understood, they still had faith in it. If a normal cultivation technique wanted to find a door in one's body, shouldn't it be opened? However, this cultivation technique was completely the opposite. It didn't need to open the door at all. Instead, it needed to close the door. However, because this cultivation technique came from the sacred mountain, they didn't doubt it at all. At this moment, They only focused on the cultivation technique's requirements and began to continuously calculate and search for the existence of that door in the depths of their bodies, souls, and minds. Next to the sacred mountain, they seemed to be able to receive some kind of silent blessing. This kind of support allowed them to cultivate at an unimaginably fast speed. Normally, if they were somewhere else, it would probably take them tens of thousands of years to cultivate this cultivation technique to completion. However, at this moment, at the foot of the sacred mountain, even the one who spent the longest time among them only spent 3 days to calculate the existence of that door. The moment they saw that door, these cultivators also understood why it had to be closed. This was because at this moment, the door was completely open. Moreover, there were endless, terrifying storms constantly surging out of it, constantly washing away everything that they could find, including their bodies, their minds, their souls, and everything else. At this moment, they could clearly feel that the existence of the storm had indeed injected great power into their bodies. However, at the same time, it was also destroying their bodies and weakening their potential. We must close it. At this moment, all the cultivators here made up their minds. Although it brought great power, the damage to their bodies and the weakening of their potential was real. Compared to the benefits, these cultivators were obviously more unwilling to suffer this kind of disadvantage. With this thought in mind, they did not dare to be distracted. At this moment, they started to circulate everything they had according to the cultivation technique and tried their best to close the door. The difficulty of finding the door and closing it were two completely different things. It was just like the difficulty of seeing a mountain and lifting it up were completely different. If they wanted to close the door, they first had to block the storm that was constantly surging out. Secondly, they had to have the strength to push the door. Currently, among these cultivators, none of them could do it. Even if he had the secret art to rely on, he was still unable to do it. These cultivators had been trying here for several years, but they had not been able to make any breakthroughs. At most, they would only be able to advance a little further in the storm. Even the ones closest to the door would still be at least 10 meters away from it. This distance was not enough for these cultivators to touch the door, nor was it enough for them to close it again. At this moment, one of the cultivators sighed. "It seems that we can't do it with our own strength." After a few years, even the slowest of them could guess that the others had obtained about the same amount as them. At this moment, each of them had reached a bottleneck in their cultivation. Even if they were still wary of other cultivators, they could only temporarily put down their guard and communicate with each other. Hearing this, the other cultivators came to a realization and recovered from their state of diligent cultivation. "Fellow cultivator, do you have any suggestions?" Another cultivator asked. "I'm still 18 meters away," the first cultivator said. When the other cultivators heard this, they were stunned at first and then came to a realization. Then, they began to report the distance one by one. It was obvious that they had reached a tacit understanding. This distance was obviously the distance between them and the door. After confirming with each other, they turned their gazes to one of the cultivators. This cultivator was only 11 meters away from the door. Among all the cultivators, he was the one closest to the door. This most likely meant that this cultivator's method of advancing was better than theirs. At this moment, many of the cultivators who had reached a bottleneck set their sights on him. Since the cultivator dared to say it, he naturally had his own thoughts. At this moment, he saw how everyone was looking at him and sighed. "Fellow cultivators, you don't have to look at me like that. Since I dare to say it, it naturally means that my method is no longer effective." Hearing this, the others could not help but feel disappointed. However, it was not to the extent that they completely ignored this cultivator's method. Instead, they all looked at him with anticipation. At this moment, another cultivator said, "Since fellow cultivators are willing to speak, I presume you all have the intention to cooperate. Why don't we discuss Tao?" His words were echoed by all the other cultivators. The content of the Tao discussion was naturally related to the cultivation method. The method of Tao discussion was naturally to talk about one's understanding of the cultivation method, as well as the various comprehensions of the cultivation process of the cultivation method. Through the exchange of understanding and insights, everyone would be able to deepen their understanding of the cultivation method. Once their understanding of the cultivation method deepened, it was obvious that they would be able to find a more efficient method. This DAO discussion lasted for a few months. These cultivators were all different individuals. Their own cultivation techniques were vastly different from the others. Their understanding of cultivation, the world, and the world all had their own characteristics. Under such circumstances, their understanding of the same cultivation method would naturally be quite different. And these differences were obviously the most valuable things for these cultivators. After all, through these differences, any cultivator's horizons could be broadened. Once their horizons were broadened, their inspiration would increase. With the increase in inspiration, the cultivation of the cultivation method would naturally be sped up. This difference in perspective was clearly not determined by the limits of the cultivator's understanding of the principles of the spell. Cultivators who did not have enough attainment in the cultivation method did not necessarily have a bad perspective, and it did not mean that their perspective was not special. Because of this, the cultivators who had the highest attainment in the cultivation method and whose consciousness was the closest to the door were also interested in discussing Tao with other cultivators. Of course, a high attainment was a high attainment, and the closer the cultivator was to the door, the more valuable their insights would be. After all, from a certain aspect, their insights could be confirmed to be relatively accurate. Therefore, the closer the cultivator's consciousness was to the door, the more attention they would receive in the process, and the more cultivators would pay attention to them. After the Tao discussion that lasted for a few months, every cultivator had a deeper understanding of the cultivation method. This deeper understanding was reflected in the distance between their consciousnesses and the door. After the Tao discussion, any cultivator could break through their consciousnesses and enter a range of 10 meters around the door. Even though it couldn't be considered to be huge, it at least showed that this sort of exchange and discussion of the Tao was valuable. I feel like I've reached my limit. At this moment, a cultivator sighed. It had been a few days since then. In these few days, everyone had completely digested their gains from the Tao discussion over the past few months and turned them into resources for further improvement. However, even so, there was still a long way to go before they could truly close the door. Don't forget that coming into contact with the door was only the first step. Next, they still needed to push the door plank and go up against the storm, blocking all of the storm behind the door. Perhaps I can only rely on external force. He looked at the figures of the other cultivators who were still working hard inside. He looked up at the sky and could no longer see the star world that belonged to him, which was completely covered by the fog. Although the star world had been separated from him when he entered the new reincarnation cycle, it no longer existed as a world that belonged to him. Chapter 2755. Although the world he created was directly devoured by the world and turned into stars in the sky, it was no longer his own. However, as the creator of that world, be it his understanding of that world or the various preparations he had made in that world, it was enough for him to do many unimaginable things through that world. For example, he could borrow the power of the world. In fact, this had already become a public method for the cultivators of this world. There were policies from above, and there were countermeasures from below. This world wanted all the worlds created by cultivators, wanted to turn these worlds into stars, and wanted to completely absorb these worlds as a part of itself. For cultivators, it was best if the worlds they created could belong to them forever. It was best if no one could take them away, and no one could sever the connection between them and the world. There was clearly a contradiction between the two. It was clearly impossible for cultivators to go against the world. At the very least, it was impossible for the cultivators in this world who had taken the cultivation path prescribed by this world. Therefore, for the countless cultivators in this world since ancient times, the only thing they could do was obviously to protect their own interests as much as possible without going against the world. And the way to protect the benefits was to build as many corresponding structures as possible in the world that one created, so that even if the world was taken away by the world, one could still maintain the connection with the world and borrow the power of the world. After countless years, This method had even developed into a complete system and became a fixed procedure. It was even divided into different levels according to the difficulty and amount of borrowing the world's power. At this time, the cultivators who could rush to the sacred mountain were clearly the highest existences among the countless cultivators of the central world. The cultivation methods that such existences grasped were naturally the most exquisite. If they were not exquisite enough, how could they have stood at such a height? This naturally included methods to borrow the power of the world of stars. In fact, every single one of them even had a method to borrow the power of other worlds. With a fixed procedure and a complete theory to support the structure of the world, most of the backups left behind in the world of stars naturally followed a certain pattern. In this way, as long as one grasped this pattern, it was naturally not impossible to borrow the power of the world of stars created by other cultivators. However, this method was only an external force after all. It was rather troublesome to borrow it. Moreover, the difficulty of other people's star worlds was more than 100 times higher than his own star world. Because of this method was not very useful in normal battles. Only in a situation like this, where there was no time limit and he didn't pursue how much time he needed to unleash his strength, could he borrow the power of the star world. At this moment, these cultivators were unable to approach the door with their own strength, much less close it. They finally began to look for external help and turned their gazes to the world of stars in the sky. Borrowing the power of other people's star worlds was extremely troublesome. In comparison, borrowing the power of one's own star world was many times simpler. Therefore, generally speaking, cultivators who wanted to borrow the power of star world would first choose to use their own star world. Only after mobilizing all the power in their own star world would they turn their attention to the star worlds created by other cultivators. This time was no exception. These cultivators carefully sensed their own star world. Through visualization, summoning, sacrificial offerings, resonance, and other methods, they began to mobilize the trump cards they had left in their star world. With these trump cards, they slowly pushed the power of their star world to produce a corresponding change. Through this change, strands of power from the star world would continuously descend into the cultivator's body, turning into the cultivator's own power. The power would push the cultivator's will toward the door that was constantly being blown by the wind. The power of the star world itself was naturally endless, but the power that could be mobilized through various trump cards was limited. The power that continuously fused into the cultivator's body turned into an increasingly powerful force that pushed the cultivator's will towards the door. However, the process could not be sped up no matter what. Moreover, when they got close to the door, they began to feel like they were running out of strength. Faced with this situation, the cultivators could only continue to exert more power, channeling more power from the star worlds into themselves to push their wills closer to the door. In this manner, when the first cultivator came into contact with the door, several days had passed. The amount of power he had mobilized from the star world was more than 18. If it wasn't for the fact that these star worlds were created by this cultivator himself, and the trump cards he had left in them were powerful enough, he would not have been able to mobilize the power of so many worlds at once. However, it was clear that the most important thing for this cultivator was not to be emotional about the number of worlds he had mobilized. Instead, he should be paying attention to the door that his will was in contact with. What kind of door is this? It seems to contain all the mysteries of the world. At this moment, the cultivator had already understood the essence of this door. On the door, he could find things that he had comprehended before, guessed about, and even mysteries that he could not imagine. Through these principles and mysteries, he could clearly feel that he seemed to be able to reap great rewards at every moment. However, at the same time, he was also enduring unimaginable pressure at every moment. His body and mind were overwhelmed, and he felt like he would completely collapse in the next moment. After understanding the essence of this door, he also understood what the storms that rushed out of the door were. How are they storms? They were clearly the mysteries of the world, the truths of the universe, and the essence of cultivation. In a daze, he seemed to understand why it had been so easy and smooth for him to create the world of stars in the past, and why it had been so easy for the world to take away the world he had created in the end, and why he had been so powerless. So, it's all because the world is just using my body to materialize the world. He muttered with a bitter expression. It was like someone who had obtained some kind of achievement and was full of pride, only to be suddenly told by someone that everything he had previously obtained was deliberately given to him by others, and that every battle he had won was deliberately lost by his opponent. It went without saying how aggrieved and irritated he felt. At this moment, this was how the cultivator felt. Only by closing this door can I step onto the true path of cultivation. As these thoughts flashed through his mind, he completely understood the meaning of closing this door. As expected, just one touch and you already know what it means. There's no need to waste words at all. At this moment, another cultivator sighed. The cultivator turned around and saw a bitter expression. It was obvious that the cultivator had also come into contact with the door and sensed the truth that he had sensed. Next, one after another, all the cultivators reached the same step. They also used their wills to come into contact with the door, and they also sensed the essence of the door and learned about the nature of the storm. Although the door could be said to be a bridge to communicate with the world and was constantly absorbing endless truths and mysteries from the world outside, at this moment, none of them were willing to keep this door open. Endless truths and mysteries were constantly being poured into their bodies. This sounded like a good thing. It seemed like they could obtain all the truths they wanted from the world at all times. However, this was only what it sounded like. For these cultivators, each of them clearly felt that this situation was already an obstacle for them to take a step forward. If this continued, even when the world was destroyed, they would not be able to walk their own path, and they would not be able to truly step onto their own path of cultivation. Therefore, at this moment, not a single one of these cultivators did not plan to close this door. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was at the center of the sacred mountain, smiled and thought to himself, as expected, it can be done with the power of the star world. There's no need to use any supplementary methods. Originally, he had imparted the cultivation method to these cultivators to conduct experiments. Since it was an experiment, naturally, everything could not be perfect. In reality, when these cultivators were unable to come into contact with the gate with their own wills, he already knew that these cultivators' foundations were much weaker than he had imagined. Perhaps he would need to give them some supplementary methods or cultivation methods in order for them to successfully achieve their goals. However, he did not expect these cultivators to all have the means to borrow the power of the star world. And in the end, none of them actually needed his intervention to truly come into contact with the door. They could come into contact with the door on their own without any further assistance. This also meant that the cultivation method he had created could be considered a complete success. The reason for this was very simple. As long as one could come into contact with the door, the rest was actually very simple. In fact, the true difficulty of the entire process was to use one's will to come into contact with the door. After that, closing the door seemed even more difficult, but in reality, this step could be said to be difficult, but it was also extremely simple. The reason why this was said to be so was because the next step completely depended on how determined the living being's will was. If the cultivator's will to close the door was strong enough, then the door would even close on its own without the need to use any force. However, if the will to close the door was not strong enough, then the door would be so heavy that it would surpass the heavens and earth. Even with the power of the star world, it could not be moved. It was precisely because of this that closing the door could be said to be difficult, but it was also extremely simple. At this moment, the cultivators naturally did not know this. At this moment, they had already made countless mental preparations. In fact, many of them had even mobilized all the power of the star world that they could control and use to strengthen their will. Then, one after another, they began to push the two panels of the door with their will, trying their best to close the door. Huh? How come it's so easy? A cultivator suddenly exclaimed. However, he had only used a bit of force, and the door had already closed with a loud bang and a flash, trapping all of the storm behind the door. Easy. How come mine didn't move at all? At this moment, a cultivator asked indignantly. However, he felt as if he was pushing a star world. He used almost all his strength, but the panel of the door didn't move at all. How is it easy? I'm fine. Although it's not easy, I could just barely push it, another cultivator said. At this moment, the other cultivators' expressions also changed slightly. Some felt relaxed, some felt troubled, and some even felt anxious because they could not achieve their goal. How can this be? Why is there such a difference between us? The cultivator who first closed the door couldn't help but be astonished. It was certain that there was a difference in cultivation between them. At any rate, they were all cultivators with different cultivation techniques. Not to mention, their ages were completely different as well. It was normal for there to be a difference in cultivation levels. However, even if there was a difference in cultivation levels, the difference between them should not be this great. How could someone feel that it was extremely easy to close the door without using much force, but someone feel that the door was so heavy that it could not be moved at all? At this moment, a cultivator suddenly said, "Perhaps the ease of closing the door has something to do with the strength of one's will." It was a cultivator who felt that it was a little difficult to close the door, but was still able to open it. Chapter 2756. At this moment, Luo Fan could clearly see the path of immortality that he had imbued on the sacred mountain continuously surging into the cultivator's body. It was changing the cultivator's essence in an extremely subtle and mysterious way, gradually giving the cultivator an eternal charm that he had never come into contact with in his countless reincarnations. No matter what, this cultivator was an existence that had reached the peak of this parallel space. There was no need to doubt his talent, wisdom, and temperament. The path of immortality was not too complicated for such an existence. If he could truly come into contact with the path of immortality, he would be able to reach an extremely high level in no time at all. The reason why he could not attain immortality before was very simple. It was because of the restrictions of the world, or rather, the restrictions of the world's founder. Now that the restrictions had been nullified by the technique that Luo Fan had imparted to him, the path of immortality was no longer a taboo for him. Instead, it had become a path that was similar to ordinary paths. Under such circumstances, his talent, wisdom, and temperament could naturally be used perfectly on this path. In addition, at this moment, Luo Fan had placed the path of immortality in front of him. It was as if he had taken the initiative to force it into his body. With such support, how could he not improve quickly? At this moment, although only a few breaths had passed, he had already grasped the basics of the path of immortality. He could clearly sense the existence of the path of immortality that he had never felt before, and even thought that it was impossible for it to exist in the world. At this moment, he felt an indescribable emotion rise from the bottom of his heart. As expected, "I've seen a whole new world," he mumbled. The aura around him surged, and the eternal charm grew stronger. He could vaguely sense that he was getting further and further away from reincarnation. He had a clear grasp that the end of his lifespan was being pushed back at an extremely fast speed. In just a few dozen breaths, the end of his lifespan had been pushed back by a few hundred years. The changes to his body immediately attracted the attention of the other cultivators. "What's this?" The cultivators were surprised to sense the eternal charm that had appeared on the cultivator's body, and their expressions became uncertain. They couldn't directly sense the grand Tao of longevity. Even if the grand Tao of longevity had already fused with their bodies and souls, they still couldn't sense anything. However, this did not mean that they could not sense eternity. In this world, apart from the great Tao of immortality, there were too many eternal things. For example, the heaven and earth, as well as the various things in the heaven and earth that would not be worn away by time. All of these contained more or less eternal charm. Although these cultivators could not directly sense the Tao of immortality, with their senses, wisdom, and temperament, it was obvious that the eternal charm in these things could not escape their senses. Because of this, they could clearly sense the eternal charm that appeared on that cultivator at this moment. Sensing that, the cultivators there grew shocked and bewildered. They knew very well what eternity was. Although most of them no longer pursued eternity and instead pursued self-improvement and the improvement of their strength, it did not mean that they did not want to pursue eternity. It was just like how yous no longer talked about their Chinibu goals after they passed their Chinibu period, but it did not mean that they had forgotten their Chinibu goals. Eternity was the same for these cultivators. The reason why they no longer pursued eternity was because they had a clear understanding of the world. They knew that eternity was impossible for them, and it would be a waste of energy to focus on it. Under such circumstances, one could imagine the shock that the eternal charm that appeared on that cultivator's body had brought to the hearts of these cultivators. These cultivators could be called geniuses, so how could their imagination be bad? In an instant, almost all of them connected the eternal charm with the door that their wills had come into contact with. Closing the door will give us eternity, a cultivator murmured. At this moment, the other cultivators' eyes also lit up. Among these cultivators, the reason why so many of them were not determined to close the door was because the essence of the door was their connection with heaven and earth, and the endless laws and mysteries of heaven and earth flowed out from it. If they closed the door, it might bring them all sorts of benefits, but it also meant that it would be more difficult for them to comprehend the mysteries of heaven and earth in the future and experience the beauty of creation. Because of this, even though the cultivators wanted to deal with the door, most of them felt that the best way to deal with it was not to completely close it. Instead, they would close a small part of it and leave a small gap. That way, they would be able to prevent the tide of information from drowning them and suppressing their own growth. At the same time, they could also use the gap left to receive the mysteries of heaven and earth, the principles of cultivation, so that they could obtain the nutrients they needed from heaven and earth. If they could succeed with this choice, it would be the best of both worlds. It was precisely because they had such thoughts that they were not resolute enough in closing the door. That was why they could not move the door. However, the situation now was different from before. After the cultivator said, "Closing the door will give you eternity," the meaning of closing the door was completely different for them. Who did not want eternity? These cultivators, who had reincarnated time and time again and gave up everything they had a stronger obsession with eternity. This obsession was enough to suppress their desire for the laws of heaven and earth, the mysteries of the universe, and the mysteries of cultivation that continuously flowed out of the door. At this moment, all kinds of thoughts of leaving a gap in the door were erased from their minds, and they became more and more determined to close the door. As this hesitant thought was erased, the force that stopped them from closing the door quickly dissipated. In the end, after a series of invisible muffled sounds, the doors were closed in the blink of an eye. As the doors were closed, the cultivators all had a disappointed expression on their faces. Following that, their expressions immediately changed to one of enlightenment. Shortly after, this enlightenment turned into indescribable excitement. In this excitement, their bodies began to emit the charm of eternity. It was obvious that they had all entered the door of the path of immortality. So that's how it is. So there really is a path of immortality in this world. Ha ha! A cultivator laughed out loud. His expression was extremely fanatical, and tears flowed down from the corners of his eyes uncontrollably. Hearing his words, they thought back to their countless years of cultivation and the countless cycles of reincarnation they had given up over and over again, and all the cultivators present couldn't help but sigh. For these cultivators, after opening up their star worlds, they could all let their wills reincarnate again and again. Even their memories would not be damaged because of this, and they did not even have any so-called mysteries in the womb. However, to them, each reincarnation was only the result of the operation of the world's laws. It was difficult for them to control this reincarnation. In other words, they could indeed be sure that they could be reborn after death and reincarnate into the human world. However, when they would reincarnate and where they would appear was not something they could be sure of. To them, this sort of situation was extremely fatal. As cultivators, they were not extremely emotionless existences. As they lived in the world, they would naturally interact with other living beings and establish emotional connections with them. During these reincarnations, they did not know how many times they had encountered friends and lovers that they were willing to give up everything to be with forever. However, no matter what kind of emotional connection they had, once they reincarnated, it was very likely that it would be completely severed. This was actually very easy to understand. It was impossible to determine the time of reincarnation, and it was impossible to determine the location of reincarnation. With the vastness of this world, the next time he reincarnated, he might have completely lost the location of his previous reincarnation. In fact, the country he had reincarnated in last time might have already been completely annihilated in this world during the time he was reincarnated. If that was the case, wouldn't everything that they had encountered in their previous reincarnation and all the emotional connections they had established be annihilated in history as well? Even if the existence that they had established an emotional connection with was also a cultivator and had the ability to reincarnate, this situation could only be slightly improved. It was impossible to avoid. The uncertainty of the time of reincarnation was enough for two cultivators to never see each other again for the rest of their lives. Every single one of these cultivators had reincarnated thousands of times. During their long reincarnations, the number of times they had experienced this kind of regret could be written into a long book. For such a cultivator, the true meaning of eternity was self-evident. If they could truly be eternal and live forever without the restrictions of reincarnation and without the need to randomly open a new beginning every once in a while, then these kinds of regrets would be greatly reduced. And if they could impart this method of eternity and let the people they cared about obtain eternity, then these regrets would completely disappear. At this moment, these cultivators were extremely excited, and they no longer had the calmness they had before. At this moment, the cultivator said to the other cultivators, "I want to spread the path of immortality, even if I have to give up everything I have." There was a warning in his words. He wanted to express his firm will to the other cultivators here. He wanted to let them know that he was not joking and warn the other cultivators not to stop him. If they tried to stop him, he would definitely fight them to the death. The other cultivators revealed wry smiles. One of them said, "Fellow Taoist is worrying too much. I think all of us are thinking the same thing." That cultivator looked at the others, and sure enough, all of their eyes were filled with determination. This kind of light was the light of giving up everything to achieve one's goal. "I see, I was wrong. I apologize to everyone." That cultivator smiled, and there was a hint of embarrassment on his face, but it was only a little. "Since we all have the same goal, why don't we join together and form an immortality alliance?" Another cultivator suggested. "Great!" The eyes of the cultivators lit up, and they said one after another. With this one sentence, an alliance that could affect the entire world or even the entire parallel space was established. "It seems that I don't need to do anything more," Luo Fan thought to himself with a faint smile on his face. The decision of these cultivators couldn't be any better for him. With the efforts of these cultivators, it was conceivable that this parallel space would undergo great changes from now on. The entire cultivation world would most likely be completely overturned because of this. The Tao of immortality would also gradually fuse with this parallel space, causing the entire parallel space to completely change. It was even possible that the entire world would change due to the changes in this parallel space. I wonder when he'll notice this change. Then, he turned his gaze to the creator of the world where the main body of the world was. The creator of the world was still unaware and was still making his own preparations, waiting for the arrival of the fourth great tribulation of the world. To him, his world seemed to only have the world's main body. The other parallel spaces, parallel times, parallel dimensions, and everything else seemed to not exist at all. However, after all, he was the creator of this world. Luo Fan's prying gaze still made the creator of this world feel something. At this moment, the creator of the world frowned and looked around, wanting to find the source of that gaze. Chapter 2757. Even the cultivators who wanted to maintain the connection between themselves and the world wisely gave up on their original plans in the face of the great Tao of immortality and completely turned to the side of the great Tao of immortality. Therefore, in just a few days, the cultivators of the foot of the sacred mountain had all set foot on the path of immortality, and their bodies emitted an immortal aura. The appearance of this immortal aura also meant that there was no longer any need for them to stay in front of the sacred mountain. Therefore, with a slight thought from Luo Fan, an indescribable wave acted on the cultivators' bodies and flicked them out of the region where the sacred mountain was located. They directly returned to the place where they had been searching for the sacred mountain in the beginning. They had been searching for that place for hundreds of years, and it could even be said that they had established a strong foundation there. After returning here, the cultivators all felt as if a lifetime had passed. Although they had not truly set foot on the peak of the sacred mountain and had not seen the legendary god of creation, the rewards they had obtained so far were enough for them to feel that this trip was extremely worth it. One of the cultivators looked around and bowed to the other cultivators before saying, "I'll be going first. Don't worry about me, everyone." The other cultivators also seemed to have woken up from a dream. They all smiled and said, "Fellow Taoist, you can go first. We'll follow you." As they spoke, all of them bowed to each other. It didn't take long for them to disperse and scatter towards the vast and boundless central world. These cultivators were known as the 10 longevity forefathers by the later generations of this world. The path of immortality that they had spread was widely disseminated by countless cultivators, and new ones were constantly being developed. In just a short 100 years, they already had the qualifications to challenge the original cultivation system of this world. In fact, if it wasn't for the fact that the path of immortality itself required the replenishment of 18 stellar worlds, 100 years would have been enough for the new cultivation system to completely destroy the old cultivation system. However, this was clearly only temporary. Compared to the original dozens of stellar worlds, the 18 stellar worlds were much fewer worlds, which meant that the cultivators would have to go through countless reincarnations. However, the 18 stellar worlds were not something that could be completed in a single lifetime. In other words, no matter how talented a cultivator was, they would need at least 18 reincarnations to obtain 18 star worlds. As mentioned before, for these cultivators, every reincarnation was equivalent to abandoning everything they had and starting over from the beginning. It was also equivalent to having an irreparable regret engraved in his heart. As such, how could those cultivators accept it without any grudges? The reason why this malpractice hadn't appeared in the past 100 years was because this world had accumulated far too much in the past. There were simply too many cultivators who had originally possessed 18 star worlds. Since there were too many cultivators with 18 star realms, most of them had already met the qualifications to cultivate the longevity Tao that the 10 longevity ancestors had given them. Most cultivators were satisfied with the prerequisites of cultivation, so the voices of opposition were naturally not loud. However, as time passed, the cultivators who met the prerequisites for cultivation entered the sect one by one. Naturally, the only ones left were those who did not meet the prerequisites for cultivation. Their voices would gradually become the mainstream of the cultivation world. As time passed, this mainstream voice would become louder and louder. With such increasingly loud voices of dissent, there would naturally be more and more cultivators with great wisdom who would think of ways to solve this malpractice and change the prerequisites. As for whether the prerequisites could be changed, that was not nonsense. The technique that Luo Fan had created back then was not only prepared for the cultivators with the stellar worlds. External forces that could be borrowed did not necessarily require the power of the star world to be able to do so. In fact, as long as there was enough power, one did not need any external forces. In fact, no external force was needed. As long as one was skilled enough, one would be able to bypass that restriction and come into contact with that door. However, compared to other methods, borrowing the power of the stellar worlds was much easier for the cultivators in this world or in this parallel space. It was much more relaxed and intuitive, which resulted in the current illusion. In the following thousands of years, countless cultivators worked hard to bypass the prerequisites of the longevity Tao. They worked hard to dig out their potential and stimulate their wisdom. The results of their research were naturally quite remarkable. Although they could not completely avoid the need for external forces, they had already developed some methods to borrow other external forces. The people who developed this method were none other than the 10 longevity ancestors. As the 10 cultivators who had directly received the technique from Luo Fan, their understanding of the technique had already far surpassed that of other cultivators. In addition, they were almost the strongest in this world and had the most outstanding wisdom, which allowed them to barely solve this problem in the past thousands of years. The method they used was to use more powerful cultivators as external forces for other cultivators to come into contact with the door. Of course, the power of the stellar worlds was countless times stronger than the power of any cultivator. If it was just a single cultivator, it naturally could not compare to the external forces that cultivators borrowed from the stellar worlds. That was also the fundamental reason why such a simple method was regarded as a new method after so many years. The method that the 10 longevity ancestors used to bypass this power restriction was very simple. It was to use an array formation to gather the power of endless cultivators and pour it into a cultivator's body to strengthen the cultivator's will. The cultivators would then touch the door in the body and close the door. This method could not be said to be not grand. Gathering the power of endless cultivators into one to help one person open the door of immortality and give one the foundation of immortality was amazing. Such an act could be considered extravagant if it was purely for one person to open the door of immortality. However, if it was treated as a common practice and every cultivator with a foundation received this kind of baptism and treated it as a kind of obligation, it would not seem special anymore. As for whether it was feasible or not, and whether those cultivators were willing to do it, there was no need to say much. Given the prestige of the 10 longevity ancestors, it would not be a problem to force such a system to be implemented. For them, the real difficulty was actually the array formation that gathered the power of endless cultivators into one so that they would not conflict with each other and instead complement and promote each other. It was precisely because of the difficulty of the array formation that it took the 10 longevity ancestors such a long time to deduce it and establish such a system. As the system was established, the atmosphere of the entire world changed. The 10 longevity ancestors truly became the supreme existence of the entire world, or rather the entire parallel space. They had the key to the longevity of all living beings, so they had no choice but to be supreme and transcendent. The central world was simply too vast. There were trillions of countries, and the population of each country was also in the trillions. It was self-evident how difficult it was to promote a system in such a vast world and completely change the system in every place. In the end, even if the system was enough to bring longevity to all living beings and allow them to surpass the limits of their lifespans, when the system truly became the main system of the world and longevity became the true leader of the entire world, 100,000 years had passed. After 100,000 years of development, the entire world had completely changed. Although the number of countries was still the same, above the trillions of countries, there was a great alliance that included all the countries, the Longevity Alliance. Compared to the past, the Longevity Alliance was more like a real country, while the trillions of countries were more like a few prefectures within a certain country. The reason was not just because the system of longevity was established by the 10 longevity ancestors who established the Longevity Alliance. It was also because as the number of immortals increased, the originally vast world had become smaller and smaller. Originally, a cultivator who could not live forever would probably die of old age if they left the country they were in, no matter what method they used. Under such circumstances, it was easy to imagine how little communication there would be between the various countries. Even if there were some relatively close connections in certain parts of the world and formed a kind of international view, that was only in certain parts of the world. Overall, the trillions of countries would not have any contact with each other. In other words, the cultivators who had reincarnated might know what countries existed in this world, what kind of local customs existed in those countries, and what kind of wonders existed in those countries. However, they simply could not connect that country with the country they had reincarnated into. They could not determine where that country was, how to get to that country, or even if that country still existed. Under such circumstances, the entire world was naturally extremely huge in the eyes of the cultivators, so huge that it surpassed the limits of their detection. However, the current situation was completely different. As many cultivators obtained longevity, as their strength began to accumulate and increase, their mobility became many times stronger than before. This kind of mobility made it extremely easy for them to travel across countries. Once they could easily travel across countries, more information about the entire world would naturally be known by all living beings. And to a certain extent, this knowledge had already shrunk the world, so this is what our world looks like. Many cultivators could not help but sigh when they learned the true appearance of the world for the first time. This sort of sigh would appear from time to time. For cultivators who had reincarnated countless times in this world, it went without saying how complicated the emotions they felt when they sighed with emotion. In the beginning, most of the cultivators were trying their best to find the countries they had reincarnated into in the past. They were looking for the people and things they were familiar with in the past, as well as the things that they regretted when they reincarnated. Among them, some of them had rare gains and saw some people and things that were left behind. However, most of them saw the vicissitudes of life and the power of time. These various changes had a huge impact on the hearts of many cultivators. This impact on the hearts of the cultivators did not only change their moods, but it also produced an even more intense and grand impact. The relationship between the hearts of living beings and the world was rather subtle. Even Luo Fan had to admit that the hearts of living beings could produce all sorts of changes to the world. Putting aside everything else, the karma of living beings, the resentment of living beings, and the baleful aura of living beings could trigger tribulations. This was the best proof. The strong impact produced by all kinds of cultivators had also caused a great impact on the world. This kind of impact existed in all aspects, and it was difficult to distinguish if it was taken out individually. However, looking at it as a whole, the impact was like a tidal wave. It was a wave of the times, a wave of change. Under this wave, the cultivation method of the world lost the last chance to reverse the past state. For all living beings, they were already extremely resolute in opposing the cultivation method of the past. They would rather die than return to the past state. This kind of thinking had created the rolling wave of the times, the kind that would never return. After 100,000 years of development, this wave had finally completely taken shape and truly become the ruler of the world and the ruler of this parallel space. At this point, even if the 10 longevity ancestors and Luo Fan were no longer in this world, it would no longer be able to reverse the development trend. It has finally begun. On this day, Luo Fan, who was observing the parallel space in the sacred mountain, was slightly moved and a faint smile appeared on his face. More than 100,000 years was just a moment to him. Observing this world for more than 100,000 years did not cause him any pressure at all. He was still very patient, and he did not feel that he had wasted any time. At this moment, he already felt that what he had been waiting for had really appeared. Chapter 2758. At this moment, the power of the tribulations that filled this parallel space began to gather in an indescribable manner, gradually fusing into the invisible, faintly discernible great Tao of longevity. The grand Tao of longevity was something that Luo Fan had created. It existed specifically for the purpose of destroying the foundation of this world. Truth be told, it was something that was rejected by this world in the first place. Such an existence, naturally, did not have much status in this world. The reason why the great Tao of longevity was able to dominate and become the mainstream of the cultivation world was because all living beings yearned for longevity and eternity. It could be said that it was an illusory existence that was forcefully formed through the will of all living beings. In essence, it could even be said that such an existence did not exist. If people's hearts changed, then the foundation of the great Tao of longevity would be completely severed. Without the support of a powerful force, it might be completely erased by this world and this parallel space at any time. However, after being enriched by the power of the killing intent, the originally illusory great Tao of longevity began to rapidly solidify. Before anyone knew it, it had completely broken away from its illusory nature and become real. It even materialized and hung in the sky in an extremely obvious manner beneath the sacred mountain. It was like a rainbow that held up the sacred mountain. The instant the great Tao of longevity took form, all the cultivators in this parallel space suddenly sensed that the formation that they had helped to build, the one that connected all the cultivators in the central world, had gained an indescribable vitality. It was now vaguely showing signs of forming its own foundation and becoming a whole of its own. It had formed its own foundation. That meant that this formation no longer needed any cultivators to maintain it. Just the formation itself could exist forever and operate forever. It was the same even if all the cultivators that made up the formation stopped supporting it at the same time. At this moment, it could be said that the formation had truly become the fundamental law of this world, or rather this parallel space. From today onwards, as long as any cultivator used this formation to step into the door of longevity, they would automatically become a part of the formation. They would no longer need their own consent, nor would they need their seniors to connect them to the formation. The formation of the various laws meant that the great Tao of longevity had truly gained a foothold in this world. It had truly become the fundamental law of this world, or rather, this parallel world. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan had a strange expression on his face. He seemed to be deep in thought, but he also seemed to be inexplicably excited. There was no need to say much about his thoughts. The changes in front of him allowed him to gain a deeper understanding of the great tribulation of the world. It was supposed to bestow the great Tao of longevity to the world. It was supposed to allow the world to obtain greater potential and have more room to grow. However, when it really appeared in this world, the great Tao of longevity had instead become the tribulation of the world, causing unimaginable damage to the world. That kind of situation revealed a deeper level of profundity about tribulations and made him realize that anything and everything could become tribulations. Even if it was an increase in power, or even if it was a benefit, as long as the method was appropriate, it could become a tribulation and cause irreparable damage to the world. What made him inexplicably excited was that after the great Tao of longevity took form under the blessing of the tribulation, it also meant that the entire parallel space had fallen into the control of the great tribulation of the world. It also meant that the parallel space had become the base camp of the tribulation. From this moment on, the countdown for the destruction of this part of the world would begin from this moment on. Let me see how it develops next. Luo Fan thought to himself. He looked at the main body of the world with some anticipation. Of course, he was only looking at the main body of the world. He didn't cast his gaze directly at the central world like before, where the creator of the world was. At that very moment, the grand Tao of longevity within the parallel space was constantly extending its tentacles outwards. Gradually, it reached the countless worlds of stars within the parallel space. Although a large portion of the worlds had been created by the cultivators who had existed in the central world in the past, it didn't mean that all the worlds had the same origin. In fact, most of the worlds that were relatively far from the central world were worlds that had been born on their own. In reality, most of the planetary realms that were further away from the central world were worlds that were born of their own accord. Perhaps these worlds would revolve around the central world due to various laws, but that was only because of the effects of the laws as a whole. It didn't mean that these worlds truly placed all of their focus on the central world. Perhaps these worlds would revolve around the central world due to various laws, but that was only because of the effects of the laws as a whole. It didn't mean that these worlds truly placed all of their focus on the central world. There were naturally many such worlds with all sorts of wonders. They even had ecosystems, civilizations, cultivation worlds, and countless cultivators. However, because the laws in these worlds weren't complete enough, or perhaps because the creator of the world didn't focus on them. Although there were cultivators in these worlds, the cultivation paths they took were similar to those in the central world. They both had the same goal of creating worlds, but in the end, the worlds they created would fuse with their own worlds in a subtle way and strengthen them bit by bit. Not only would they be unable to obtain eternal life, but they would also be unable to obtain their own worlds. But now, as the great Tao of longevity began to extend its tentacles out of the central world and into the many worlds, the situation began to change. The cultivators who stood at the peak of the world of stars, who couldn't comprehend the great Tao of longevity before, unknowingly came into contact with a supreme truth that didn't exist in the world before. Moreover, after coming into contact with this supreme truth, they suddenly understood that there was something in their bodies that was preventing the descent of this supreme truth and preventing them from truly obtaining it. After that, they gradually comprehended the method to break through this shackle and this obstruction. As the process progressed, more and more cultivators who had set foot on the great Tao of longevity appeared in the various worlds. They gradually replaced the original cultivation systems of the worlds that weren't complete in the first place. For cultivators, the expansion of the great Tao of longevity naturally brought them endless benefits, allowing them to obtain eternal life that they didn't even dare to dream of in the past. As for the great Tao of longevity, this change had also brought him quite a lot of benefits. It must not be forgotten that the very foundation of the great Tao of longevity was formed from the gathering of the beliefs of many cultivators. Now, more and more cultivators had set foot on the great Tao of longevity, and more cultivators viewed the great Tao of longevity as the supreme great Tao. As such beliefs continued to gather, the great Tao of longevity naturally grew stronger and stronger. As the great Tao of longevity grew stronger, it naturally had an unimaginable effect on the endless power of tribulations, causing the power of tribulations that surged in from the passage between the tribulations level and this world to grow in number. In the end, like a swarm of bees, it poured into the world, or to be more specific, into the parallel space, the great path of immortality in the parallel space. So this is how it's done. At this moment, Luo Fan seemed to be deep in thought. He had already sensed how the power of tribulations in this world was being sucked in and out. The power of the tribulations in this part of the world was constantly being devoured by the tribulation passageway. In other words, as it continuously entered this world, a portion of the power of tribulations was constantly leaving this world. Before this, he couldn't truly understand the meaning of this sucking in and out, and he couldn't even clearly sense how it existed. But now, the situation was completely different. After all, he was the origin of the great Tao of immortality in this parallel space. The great Tao of immortality grew stronger and stronger, and the great Tao of immortality became more and more closely integrated with the power of tribulations. Naturally, his perception of the power of tribulations deepened, and he gained a deeper understanding and comprehension of this world and this parallel space. These various enhancements allowed him to finally discover what he hadn't grasped before, the way the power of tribulations moved between this world and the tribulation level. In fact, the power of the tribulations was indeed the power of tribulations. However, the power of tribulations that entered this world was completely different from the power of tribulations that left this world. The power of tribulations that entered this world was the purest power of tribulations. Although it was constantly changing, it was fundamentally just a different manifestation of the power of tribulations. In fact, the power of tribulations was still incomparably pure. However, the power of tribulations that left this world was completely different. Although the power of tribulations that left this world was still the power of tribulations, it was no longer pure. It contained too much information that belonged to this world. It included the profundities of the laws and laws of this world, the profundities of the grand Tao of longevity of this world, and all sorts of indescribable information about everything in this world, and so on and so forth, and so on and so forth. After these various types of information entered the tribulation level, through various indescribable changes, they changed the way the tribulation level worked on this world, causing the power of tribulations that poured into this world to undergo some indescribable changes, making it more suitable for this world. In other words, it could have a greater impact on this world. This impact, in turn, changed the situation of this world, changed the characteristics of this world, and changed the information contained in every aspect. These various changes merged into the power of tribulations and returned to the tribulation level through the passage. After that, another cycle began. It could be said that the way the power of tribulations destroyed this world was becoming more and more perfect with every passing moment, and it was becoming more and more targeted. It was as if two organizations were in the process of fighting, and one of them had already infiltrated the other into a sieve and could grasp everything about the other organization at all times. It went without saying how great the disparity between the two sides was in such a battle. At this moment, the creator of the world within the main body of the world finally sensed something. He stared dumbfoundedly at the faint silhouette of the great Tao of longevity that had appeared out of nowhere in his main body of the world. The silhouette of the great Tao of longevity had appeared beneath his sacred mountain like a rainbow. It lifted the sacred mountain and borrowed the wondrous characteristics of the sacred mountain to project itself to every region of the central world, entering the field of vision of every living being in the central world. The great Tao of longevity? He was extremely shocked when he saw the projection of the great Tao of longevity. He was extremely repulsed by the idea of longevity. He believed that longevity was the enemy of the world, a flaw in the perfection of the world. As long as longevity existed, the world would be an unhealthy and incomplete world, a world with limited potential for development. Under such circumstances, he would never voluntarily allow something like the great Tao of longevity to appear in his world that could bestow longevity to all living beings. But now, the great Tao of longevity had clearly appeared in his main body of the world. It was so close to the sacred mountain, and it was even being transmitted to every corner of the central world through the sacred mountain. No matter how one looked at it, this could only be a method of the great Tao of longevity. This was because the tribulations produced by the great Tao of longevity could be called the great Tao of longevity. This was the first time the creator of the world, who had experienced countless tribulations and was extremely experienced in overcoming tribulations. He was actually at a loss for what to do at this moment. He didn't know how to deal with this tribulation. He had made countless preparations for the upcoming fourth great Tao of longevity. In fact, he had even thought that he would dare to repel the tribulation as soon as it arrived. Chapter 2759. This great tribulation was completely different from the past. It came so suddenly for the creator of this world, but it was also so difficult to resist. In the blink of an eye, he felt the world he had created begin to shake. The great Tao that had been running through the entire world seemed to have been stained, and it began to turn murky bit by bit. This kind of change made his originally clear mind feel as if a thin layer of gauze was covering it. Soon after, all the living beings in the world vaguely sensed the changes in the world. Compared to the parallel spaces, there were many more cultivators of a higher level, and they immediately sensed that there was an existence that they had always dreamed of in this world for a moment. The hearts of the people changed. The great Tao of immortality that had originally been just a projection began to solidify bit by bit. The endless power of tribulations instantly gathered towards the great Tao of immortality that was projected over from every corner of the world. It began to continuously amplify the great Tao of immortality's power and increase its substance. The aura of immortality and the charm of eternity continued to strengthen as the great Tao of immortality became more substantial. The many worlds of stars outside the central world began to undergo indescribable changes as the changes took place. Vaguely, the way the many stars revolved seemed to be moving towards a completely new pattern. It was unknown what year it was, but it turned into a brand new way of operating that had never appeared before. Immortality. I want immortality. In a certain location, a cultivator who had already formed 81 worlds of stars and obtained eternity in his mind finally roared and expressed the true desire that he had been suppressing for tens of thousands of years. It must be said that even if one formed 81 worlds of stars and reached the peak of the cultivation system of this world and reached the end, what was eternal was only one's mind and spirit. One's physical body and power still couldn't last forever. They could only be whittled away with the passage of time. In the end, after a certain amount of time, one would enter the cycle of reincarnation again and suffer the pain of being separated by life and death. This appearance, in essence, was not much different from those cultivators who had not cultivated this cultivation system to the peak. Compared to cultivators who had yet to cultivate to the peak, their souls were eternal and could experience countless reincarnations until the world fell. As for those who had yet to reach the pinnacle of this cultivation system, although they were almost eternal in the eyes of ordinary mortals, the number of times they could reincarnate was still limited. Even if 80 star worlds were created, as long as the 81st star world was not created, then there would be a limit to the reincarnation cycle. The essence of the star world would definitely be continuously worn away by the reincarnation cycle. However, this could not change the regret that every reincarnation brought to the cultivators. It could not change the torture that every reincarnation brought to the cultivators. Under such circumstances, even the cultivators who had reached perfection in this cultivation system were extremely fervent in their pursuit of immortality. At this moment, the cultivator who spoke was the most talented among the cultivators who had cultivated the cultivation system of this world to perfection. In other words, he was the one who was most compatible with the path of immortality. Although the Tao of longevity had just appeared and had yet to stabilize, he had already sensed the essence within it. He was certain what kind of effect this Tao would bring to his body, and he was very decisive. After shouting those words, he made a prompt decision to mobilize all the power of the world of stars he could to support his own mind and brazenly charge towards the door that he had sensed earlier, the door that was preventing him from achieving immortality. Compared to the cultivators who had been personally taught by Luo Fan, this cultivator who had cultivated the cultivation system of this world to perfection was many times more brilliant. It could be said that the process was extremely smooth, and he brazenly came into contact with the two panels of the door. Immediately after, with a brazen movement, he closed the two doors, causing them to instantly close the door completely. The moment the door was closed, the cultivator felt an indescribable sense of loss. At the same time, he also felt a sense of elation, as if he was a fish in the ocean and a bird in the sky. The path of immortality that he could only vaguely sense suddenly became unprecedentedly clear in his eyes. With a slight movement of his heart, endless charm of immortality surged into his body, causing his essence to rapidly sublimate. His entire body began to emit an increasingly dense charm of eternity. In just a few breaths of time, he had entered the door of immortality. As someone who had cultivated the cultivation system of this world to perfection, one could imagine how much control the cultivator had over his body and mind had reached an unbelievable level. At this moment, he could clearly feel that his lifespan had been extended by at least twofold. Moreover, this was only the beginning. As he sensed this, his lifespan continued to increase and extend, as if it would never have a limit. This change instantly made him feel that everything he had done before was already meaningful. Even if it was just this little bit of gain, it was enough for him to completely close the door that connected him to the world. After all, He had completely cultivated the cultivation system of this world to perfection. Since he had already cultivated it to perfection, the cultivation of this world was naturally meaningless to him. The door that connected him to the world seemed precious, but he no longer had any use for it. Exchanging the door that he could not use for the increase in his lifespan that he had dreamed of, no one would think that he had suffered a loss no matter how one looked at it. In a trance, he felt that he had received some kind of enhancement that was getting stronger and stronger. His progress on the path of immortality was improving at an unimaginable speed. Every instant, he felt that he had taken a huge step forward, and his lifespan had increased by a large margin. Just like that, in just a few minutes, he actually felt that his lifespan had reached a state that was close to immortality. Even though he was still one last obstacle away from true immortality and still needed to break through it, compared to the beginning, the improvement was so great that even he could not believe it. At the same time, after stepping onto the path of immortality, he also felt that his strength had started to increase continuously. Although his spirit had obtained longevity and he had opened up so many worlds of stars, after reincarnation, the strength he possessed was only slightly more outstanding than that of ordinary living beings. Perhaps he could be called a superman or a deity by ordinary people, but if he wanted to move mountains and drain seas, or destroy cities and countries, he could forget about it. But now, he felt that although there was an inexplicable barrier between him and the world, he could use the power of the world and the outside world more freely. In fact, he even vaguely felt that he could control some kind of incredible power that was hidden in the depths of the world. How powerful was this power? Although he hadn't really tested it yet, his intuition told him that the so-called destruction of cities and countries was nothing compared to this power. At that instant, a cold snort was heard by the cultivator. "You've been used by the tribulations. You deserve to die." Following this cold snort, an overwhelming force descended from the sky and pressed down on the cultivator. This overwhelming force was so strong that it was as if the boundless heaven and earth had erupted at the same time and crushed down. Before it even got close, the cultivator had already felt a sense of despair from the bottom of his heart. Deserve to be killed? What have I done? At that instant, an indescribable viciousness surged in the cultivator's heart. He was merely pursuing the immortality that all living creatures were after. What kind of heinous crime had he committed? Why did the heavens treat him like this? Could it be that he was born to obediently accept the unfair fate that the heavens and earth had imposed on him? Could it be that he was born to be reincarnated again and again, abandoning his emotions and everything that he cared about time and time again? How could there be such a logic in the world? At that instant, even though he knew that this overwhelming force was extremely terrifying and that he might not be able to resist it, he still summoned his courage and brazenly mobilized the unimaginable power that he had never tried before after stepping onto the path of immortality and blasted it at the overwhelming force. Crack, 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 crack. Earth-shattering thunderclaps instantly spread through the entire world. They even stirred up the stellar world outside the central world, causing the stellar world's operations to fall into an indescribable state of chaos. Looking from the starry sky, one area of the central world suddenly collapsed. It was as if a black hole had suddenly appeared and begun to frantically devour everything around it. That location was none other than the cultivator's location. Just now, when the terrifying power that the cultivator mobilized collided with the overwhelming power, it caused the world to collapse. Even the space where the cultivator stood was completely annihilated. The cultivator's body was also instantly annihilated by the terrifying annihilation effect. Only a faintly discernible wisp of consciousness remained in the black hole, as if it was a dead object that wouldn't dissipate. At that moment, endless power continuously gushed out from the black hole and spread in all directions. Even though it was continuously bombarded and annihilated by the overwhelming force, it didn't change its momentum. The power continued to gush out endlessly and spread endlessly in all directions. That power was none other than the power of a tribulation. At that moment, the power seemed to have been detonated. It frantically surged out from the depths of the world and continuously landed on the ground. It began to distort the space-time of this world and change the laws of this world. Damn it! The creator of this world roared angrily at that moment. That's right, the one who attacked the cultivator just now was the creator of this world. He was also the one who spoke just now. It was because when he sensed the world from the sacred mountain at the core of the world, he noticed that a great amount of tribulations had appeared out of thin air at a certain location, pouring into the body of a cultivator who had abandoned the cultivation system he had created. Because of this, the cultivator's body gradually gained a lot of the aura of longevity that the creator of this world loathed. It was precisely because of this that the creator of this world stretched out his hand to wipe out the cultivator. This was because the cultivator was only a cultivator who had just set foot on the path of longevity. Although the cultivator was powerful compared to ordinary cultivators, the cultivator was so weak that it wasn't even worth mentioning to the creator of this world. Therefore, the cultivator's hand was filled with overwhelming power, as if the boundless world had gathered and pressed down at the same time. But to the creator of this world, it was just a small trick that he had casually used. In fact, the creator of this world only used it once. However, the consequences of such a casual action were thousands of times more severe than he had imagined. He did not expect the cultivator to be able to directly control the power of the tribulation. He did not expect the cultivator to be able to ignite the power of the tribulation at the moment of his death, causing the power of the tribulation to pour endlessly into the world and transform endlessly. This kind of situation would normally only happen when the world reached a certain peak during the Great Tribulation of the world. But this time, it happened when the Great Tribulation of the world had just begun. How could he not be shocked? At this moment, he understood that the fourth Great Tribulation of the world would probably be thousands of times more difficult than the previous three Great Tribulation of the world. It would probably be quite difficult to get through it. However, although he knew that the fourth Great Tribulation of the world would be relatively difficult, he did not have the intention of just giving up. At this moment, he began to use his absolute control over the world to mobilize the power of the world and began to suppress the power of the tribulation that was constantly being released. Then, he began to divide the space at the edge of the area where the power of the tribulation was constantly being released. He did his best to prevent the power of the tribulation from spreading to other areas that were not yet affected by the power of the tribulation. He wanted to ensure that the damage caused by the power of the tribulation would not be too great. Chapter 2760. It was as if the isolation method didn't exist in the face of the power of the tribulation. Even if the isolation measures cast by the creator of the world could actually isolate the world, and he was even confident that such measures would have a certain effect on the simulation of the state of chaos if placed outside the world, it did not have any effect at all in the face of the power of the tribulation. The might of the tribulation was completely unobstructed, and it passed through these obstructions and spread towards the entire world at an unimaginable speed. At that moment, a voice rang out from the black hole, "I want to live forever." Along with the voice, a feeling of eternity broke through and began to expand and strengthen wildly. In the end, the great Tao of longevity that had been projected to various parts of the world through the sacred mountain seemed to be distorted by some unimaginable power. As the rivers twisted, like 100 rivers flowing into the ocean, they surged towards the black hole on their own. It was as if the black hole was emitting an attractive force that targeted the paths of immortality. An immortal light gradually emerged from the black hole. In the beginning, the light was incomparably weak. However, as various changes occurred and the great Tao of longevity poured into it, it grew stronger at a furious rate. In just a few dozen breaths of time, he had expanded to the size of a human figure, and the light he emitted broke through the barrier of the black hole. Accompanied by the boundless power of the tribulations, it spread throughout the world. At that moment, the Creator could no longer stay on the sacred mountain and watch from afar. He frowned, and in a flash he traversed a boundless distance and arrived at the location of the black hole from a sacred mountain. When he arrived here, his whole body made a sizzling sound. The boundless power of the tribulations was like some kind of super corrosive power, and it began to crazily corrode his body. The sizzling sound was produced when the corrosive force was blocked by his power. What a powerful force! The Creator looked down at the black hole and sensed the power of the tribulation corroding his body. His expression turned even more unsightly. This was his world, and everything in it belonged to him. And now, such a black hole was wildly destroying his world, and the path of immortality that threatened to shake his fundamental beliefs had appeared out of nowhere. How could he not be furious? At that moment, the figure formed by the light gradually took shape. In the end, after who knew how many breaths, he finally broke away from the light and appeared outside the black hole. This figure was naturally the cultivator that the Creator of this world had casually erased earlier. However, compared to before, the eternal aura that this cultivator emitted was tens of thousands of times stronger. If it could be said that he was only slightly tainted with this kind of immortality before, then the current him was completely like the embodiment of immortality. This was indeed the case. At this moment, in the eyes of the Creator of this world, this cultivator had indeed become the eternal manifestation of this world. In other words, he had become the representative of the great Tao of longevity. At that moment, he seemed to be an independent being, but in reality, he was just an image of the path of immortality. Although it seemed like he had an independent mind and a perfect self, it was all because the path of immortality did not have a mind or a self. Because the path of immortality did not have a mind or a self, his will became the will of the path of immortality as he fused with it. It seemed like he had not changed at all. However, that was to be expected. After all, he had already been completely destroyed by the means of the Creator of this world. As the Creator of this world, even a casual action of his could cause great destruction to everything in this world. This living being could be said to have been completely destroyed just now. Even the last bit of willpower, the last bit of obsession, was only preserved by the great Tao of immortality because it was compatible with it. How could he be resurrected so easily in such a state? However, in reality, this kind of reappearance was not much different from resurrection. At the very least, that was the case for this cultivator. At that moment, facing the Creator of this world, he instinctively knew that this was his enemy, the greatest obstacle to his survival. Only by defeating him and making him acknowledge him could he continue to live and enjoy the eternity and longevity that he had obtained with great difficulty. Are you my enemy? The incarnation of the path of immortality said to the Creator of this world, I didn't expect it to appear in this way. Looks like I've underestimated you. The Creator of this world looked at the cultivator and sighed with a grave expression. In his eyes, the cultivator in front of him was not a living being that he had created. Instead, it was merely the convergence of the power of the tribulations, the embodiment of the power of the tribulations. Moreover, it wasn't just a single incarnation, but a whole abstract incarnation formed by the accumulation of countless incarnations. The cultivator felt that he had obtained eternal life, and what he had fused with was the most ancient and noble path of immortality in the world. However, in the eyes of the Creator of this world, the situation was completely different. In the eyes of the Creator of this world, what the cultivator before him had fused with was only the power of the tribulation. The aura that the cultivator gave off was the power of the tribulation. It was an extremely dense power of the tribulation that was completely incompatible with the world and him. The cultivator frowned and felt a slight sense of uneasiness in his heart. I'm talking to you. As he spoke, a wave of ruthlessness surged out from the depths of his heart. He could not help but raise his hand and slap at the Creator of this world. Boom, boom, boom. The entire world began to tremble violently at that moment. The terrifying power of the tribulation gathered instinctively and crazily pressed down on the Creator of this world. It tried to completely bind the Creator of this world. Facing this situation, the creator of this world sneered. With a thought, the world twisted and changed. Boundless power was born out of thin air and fiercely blocked the power of the tribulation that was gathering towards him. The two powers collided. The entire world shook violently in that instant. All the power, all the laws, even time and space started shaking violently in that instant. It was as if the strings of a zither that had been stretched taut had been plucked. At that moment, the cultivator who was facing off against the creator of this world felt his head buzz. It was as if countless unfamiliar voices had appeared out of thin air at that moment, and countless chaotic thoughts had completely drowned out his own consciousness. Under these changes, although he could still sense his body, it had become blurry and indistinct. It felt as if he was sensing something subtle behind the boundless ocean. At that moment, he had also sensed that something was wrong. However, it was clear that what truly belonged to him was just a tiny bit of willpower and obsession. His body, his power, and even all the techniques he was currently using came from the great Tao of longevity and the power of the tribulation. The strange changes at this moment clearly came from the great Tao of longevity, or rather, the power of the tribulation. Under such circumstances, how was it possible for him to use the power of the tribulation to resist this change and resolve the abnormality that had appeared here? Therefore, in the end, all his efforts could do was slightly strengthen the senses of his body. He couldn't even regain control of his own body anymore. Immediately afterward, he watched as his body transformed into the great Tao of longevity once more and poured into the central world in an unstoppable manner, vying with the great Tao of the central world for the authority to rule the world. That's right. His body had turned into the great Tao of longevity and directly clashed with the great Tao of the central world. In that instant, he could feel that his body seemed to have split into billions and trillions of parts. Like clear water seeping into sand, he continuously seeped into the great Tao. Then, through the great Tao, he continuously seeped into the central world and even the boundless starry sky beyond the central world. This cultivator was quite extraordinary. To be able to comprehend the mysteries of the Tao of immortality in such a short period of time, to be able to close the door between heaven and earth in such a short period of time, and to be able to cultivate the cultivation system to its peak in perfection under the original restrictions of this world, one could well imagine how extraordinary he was. However, no matter how extraordinary he was, he could not have reached the level where his thoughts could still be intact after splitting into billions and trillions of parts. In that instant, as he sensed that his entire body had split into billions and trillions of parts, he felt that his thoughts were gradually being erased. In a trance, he had completely lost his perception of the outside world, lost his perception of time, and even lost his perception of himself. As he lost his senses, he had truly and completely transformed into the great Tao of longevity. At this moment, an extremely ugly expression appeared on the creator's face. Damn it, I've been fooled. He spat hatefully. In his eyes, the cultivator's body had completely dissipated after being slightly blocked by him. It had turned into countless tribulations that flowed along the creator's repulsive force into the central world. It smashed into the great Tao and gradually turned into a part of the great Tao, distorting and changing the great Tao. Judging from the way things were developing, the great Tao had clearly been greatly affected. At the very least, he could see the great Tao visibly distorting and trembling at this moment. At this moment, all living beings in the central world could faintly sense an indescribable and eternal charm radiating from the depths of their bodies. Regardless of whether they were cultivators or not, all living beings in the central world had the same door that connected them to the world in the depths of their bodies. In other words, all living beings in the central world had endless mysteries of the world and the truths of the universe constantly surging out of the door and pouring into their bodies at every moment. It was precisely because of this that the cultivators who originated from among all living beings were also restricted by the door. They couldn't step onto a path that wasn't restricted by the door. But now, the great Tao was distorting and changing which was equivalent to pouring into the bodies of all living beings through the door. The various truths and mysteries that restricted the paths of all living beings were changing at this moment. There was now an additional great Tao of longevity that hadn't existed before. One could easily imagine the result of this. In that instant, countless living beings comprehended the mysteries of the great Tao of longevity and vaguely touched the door to eternal life. It seemed unbelievable since it had only been such a short period of time. But in reality, it couldn't be any more natural. After all, the number of living beings that had been changed was calculated in the trillions. With so many living beings, and such a large number of living beings, how could there be no living beings among them? How could there be a lack of living beings that were extremely compatible with the great Tao of longevity and the door to eternal life? It could be said that if it were not for the fact that the distortion of the great Tao had not stabilized and the great Tao of immortality had not been completely accepted by the great Tao in heaven and earth, there would have been a lot of living beings who had attained immortality and eternity. It would not have been like this, where there were only a few living beings who had come into contact with the door to immortality. Looks like the situation is hopeless. At this time, in the parallel space, a faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face as he thought to himself. The development in front of him was even smoother than the smoothest scenario he had imagined. Chapter 2761. Looks like I should be able to easily sever one of the shackles this time. Luo Fan looked at the main body of the world that was in full swing, and a faint smile appeared on his face. Opposite the main body of the world, the other parallel realms also started to show all sorts of chaotic phenomena. Of course, this was only chaos in the eyes of the creator of the world. In the eyes of ordinary living beings, it was the world's mercy, giving them a chance to live forever. Countless living beings who could not comprehend the path to immortality or the method to live forever unknowingly comprehended the method to live forever and obtained the chance to live forever. Countless rules that were originally regarded as eternal and unchanging were easily overturned. Parallel space, parallel time, parallel dimension. Everything seemed to have lost the peace and stability that had lasted for countless years in the blink of an eye, and they once again fell into a state of vitality. That's right, it was not a chaotic world, but a world full of vitality. The changes that came from obtaining new hope were obviously completely different from the changes that came from despair. With new hope, the changes were metamorphoses. Breaking the old order was only a prerequisite for establishing a healthier and more perfect new order. And when there was no hope and only despair, breaking the old order was the beginning of destruction. At this moment, in the many parallel realms, living beings were now preparing to welcome the new order. A new order that was filled with hope, vitality, and was extremely friendly to them. In fact, compared to them, the situation in the main body of the world was not much different in essence. If it was up to the living beings themselves, the situation would not be much different from the many parallel realms. However, it was clear that this kind of if did not happen. In the main body of the world, there was an existence that would definitely not sit back and watch the old order collapse and the rules of the world change. The creator of the world. To him, it did not matter what benefits the living beings obtained. Even if it was the light of life and death, it did not affect him too much. As long as the world did not change, as long as his view of the world was completely implemented in this world, everything in this world would reflect his view of the world, and that was enough. On the other hand, as long as his view of the world was different from this world, then even if this difference brought great benefits to this world, or even if it could expand and strengthen this world by countless times, it would still be a poison. At this time, this great Tao of immortality spread throughout the world, purifying all living beings, giving them the hope of immortality, giving them the chance to obtain eternity. This was indeed a great benefit to all living beings, but to him, it was equivalent to sand continuously seeping into his worldview. At this moment, he only felt that his worldview was becoming more and more incompatible with the world. His control and guidance of the world were rapidly weakening in this process. Vaguely, there seemed to be an unimaginable power pulling the world away from him. I really can't get past it. After looking at the world for a long time, the creator of this world could only sigh. To him, the changes in the world and the appearance of the great Tao of longevity were clearly changes caused by the fourth great tribulation of the world. Although the changes were inexplicably subtle and mysterious, completely different from the great tribulation of heaven and earth that he knew in the past. However, he himself had not survived the fourth worldly tribulation. Who could be sure that the fourth worldly tribulation would not appear in such a subtle way? This world was a world that he had created himself. Everything in this world could be said to have come from his heart. Such an existence made him believe that there were foreign cultivators who could bypass his senses and easily infiltrate his territory. Moreover, they were able to make numerous plans right under his nose and even push him in the direction of the destruction of the world. This was simply as absurd as believing that he had a third hand, but didn't feel anything at all. Compared to this absurdity, he was clearly more inclined to believe that this was a change derived from the worldly tribulation. It was the result of no external force, and it was a corresponding change that had evolved from his world and his worldview. As he thought about all sorts of things, the main body of the world began to deteriorate rapidly, and the connection between him and the world began to weaken rapidly. Faced with this situation, even though he knew that he had probably reached the end of the road, and this worldly tribulation was probably the last one that he could experience, he still did not give up. Instead, he sorted out his thoughts and began to gather all his wisdom, all his effort, all his strength, and all his might to deal with the upcoming worldly tribulation. Only a few days had passed since the eruption of the fourth apocalypse of heaven and earth, and the founder of this world realized that he could not survive this apocalypse of heaven and earth. However, from the moment he realized that he could not survive the worldly tribulation to the moment he truly failed and was truly at his wit's end, several hundred years had passed. During these several hundred years, the creator of this world had exhausted all his means to resist the various methods of the worldly tribulation. In the end, he was even willing to change his worldview to respond to the various changes in this world under the fourth worldly tribulation in order to regain control over this world and restore his connection with the world. However, it was obvious that the fourth worldly tribulation could not be resolved so easily. Even though he had changed his worldview with great wisdom, perseverance, and sacrifice, the world did not regain control over it just because of this change. This was because when he changed, the power of the worldly tribulation changed as well. He added the immortality Tao to his worldview so that the immortality Tao would no longer clash with him and shake his worldview. However, the worldly tribulation gave birth to the immortality Tao, bestowing the hope of immortality to all living beings. It shook his worldview once again, causing the connection between him and the world to drift apart once more, and this wasn't the only time. It was the same every time. No matter how the creator changed his worldview or how he added the various Taos derived from the worldly tribulation to his worldview, his efforts were all futile under the layers of changes of the worldly tribulation. If this continued, given the creator's willingness to throw caution to the wind, perhaps the worldly tribulation could continue and hold on forever. However, it was obvious that the fourth worldly tribulation was not Luo Fan. If Luo Fan had been the one guiding it, perhaps he would have used some methods to allow the process to continue as long as possible, using this place as a testing ground for his imagination. However, the worldly tribulation was different. For the worldly tribulation, it clearly only had one goal: to destroy the world and make the creator of the worldly tribulation disappear completely. Under such circumstances, the creator of the worldly tribulation naturally could not maintain the balance of the worldly tribulation, nor could he do his best to protect the worldly tribulation. As a result, the Taos and laws derived from the worldly tribulation naturally became more and more biased towards the stability of the worldly tribulation. The more Taos there were, the more chaotic and turbulent the worldly tribulation would become. Even if the birth of every single great Tao, on its own, would bring many benefits to all living beings, giving them hope and opportunities that they could only dream of but could not obtain in the past. However, due to the incompatibility of the whole, due to the conflict between the whole and the appearance of many great Taos, the outcome would not be as wonderful. The creator of the worldly tribulation could no longer endure it after just a few hundred years, and the worldly tribulation was about to be completely destroyed. The reason was that the countless Taos could no longer exist stably in the worldly tribulation. The conflict between them was no longer something that the worldly tribulation could endure. In other words, the worldly tribulation was about to be destroyed and perish. On a certain day after a few hundred years, whether it was the creator of the worldly tribulation or the many parallel existences, all living beings suddenly felt an indescribable sense of panic in their hearts. Amidst this panic, all living beings stopped fighting and cultivating. They only raised their heads to look at the sky, at the source of the panic. At this moment, they all saw that the sky had turned into an endless spider web, and it was wrapped up by endless black threads. These endless black lines were none other than the cracks in space-time, the cracks in the worldly tribulation. The moment these cracks appeared, the entire worldly tribulation seemed to be screaming in pain, and all sorts of extremely horrifying and strange sounds appeared in the hearts of all living beings. It's over. At this moment, Luo Fan's clone in that parallel space let out a long sigh. The worldly tribulation no longer had a chance to turn things around. Next, what awaited the worldly tribulation was the endless, simulated, chaotic state rushing in, completely annihilating everything in this worldly tribulation, along with the worldly tribulation itself. At this moment, if there was any existence in this worldly tribulation that could escape and continue living, it would not be Luo Fan's clone. There was only one, and that was the worldly tribulation's creator. This was because the simulated chaotic state around the worldly tribulation had already fallen into a riot. This riot made the power of the simulated chaotic state at least 1 trillion times stronger than usual. This kind of power that was 1 trillion times stronger even completely cut off the connection of the original transportation network. Under such circumstances, only the worldly tribulation's creator could gather the last of the worldly tribulation's power and use the strongest remaining power of the worldly tribulation to protect himself, allowing him to rush out of the region where the simulated chaotic state was rioting and enter the stable region where the simulated chaotic state was stable. As long as he entered the stable region, although the worldly tribulation's creator would fall into a state where he would completely lose his sense of self and everything in the outside world, at least he would survive. In the future, under certain opportunities, he might suddenly be able to open up his own worldly tribulation and begin another process of growth. However, there was a precondition for all of this, and that was that the worldly tribulation's creator had to be clear-headed enough. Only the worldly tribulation's creator had to be clear-headed enough to weigh the pros and cons and know how to make prompt decisions at a time like this could achieve all of this. Evidently, this was especially fatal to the worldly tribulation's creator. This was because he had already completely lost his sense of self. The worldly tribulation's many great Taos were so powerful that the worldly tribulation couldn't even withstand the conflict between them, ultimately causing the worldly tribulation's creator to collapse and be destroyed. Could the worldly tribulation's creator, who had incorporated the countless great Taos into his own worldview, completely contain the countless great Taos? How could such a thing happen? The worldly tribulation was an existence that the worldly tribulation's creator had created to establish a foothold in the simulated chaotic state, and its innate ability to withstand it was countless times stronger than the worldly tribulation's creator. How could the worldly tribulation's creator tolerate the changes that even the worldly tribulation couldn't withstand when they appeared in his body? It could even be said that a long time ago, after a certain great Tao was added to his worldview, the worldly tribulation's creator was no longer clear-headed. From then on, his thoughts had actually become chaotic, and he didn't even know how to weigh the pros and cons, or whether the worldly tribulation could withstand it. Instead, he merely followed his instincts and continuously incorporated the changes in power derived from the worldly tribulation into his worldview. It was precisely because of this that things really developed to this stage. Under such circumstances, the current worldly tribulation's creator didn't even have a sense of self. So how could he know how to make prompt decisions and sacrifice everything in this worldly tribulation to escape the quagmire of this worldly tribulation? Therefore, in the end, in this worldly tribulation's creator, who had the greatest hope of escaping and surviving, gave up this opportunity. What a pity. But this is good too. This way, I can know the answer faster. At this moment, Luo Fan's clone sighed. Then he slowly closed his eyes. At this moment, a thought followed an unimaginably obscure channel and disappeared without a trace in a flash. It turned out that Luo Fan's main body had retracted the thought on this clone, causing this clone to turn into a dead object in the blink of an eye. Not long after this change occurred, the entire worldly tribulation was drowned in the endless, simulated, chaotic state. Then it was completely annihilated and disappeared. Chapter 2762. At this moment, in a world of laws, Luo Fan's expression froze for a moment before a faint smile appeared on his face. In a flash, he had already arrived at the place where the Grand Tao was. Before he discovered it, the shackle that was wrapped around a certain part of the Grand Tao was so obscure and difficult to detect. Even if one thoroughly investigated the entire Grand Tao, there wouldn't be much chance of discovering its existence. However, once the existence of the shackles was discovered, the shackles became unimaginably conspicuous to Luo Fan. It was so conspicuous that he could clearly see every detail of it with just a little focus. And at this moment, there seemed to be countless cracks appearing out of thin air on the shackle. These cracks covered every part of the surface of the shackle, regardless of whether they were subtle or obvious. Along with this change, the shackle began to distort, as if something indescribable was struggling within the shackle. Immediately afterward, the cracks on the surface of the shackle became denser and denser, and the cracks also became larger and more obvious. Finally, at a certain moment, a silent cracking sound spread through Luo Fan's mind. Along with this silent cracking sound, the shackle completely collapsed, and countless tiny shackle fragments began to fly in all directions. In an indescribable manner, they continuously penetrated into the Grand Tao below, turning into nutrients for the Grand Tao. This made Luo Fan feel as if his Grand Tao of laws had received indescribable nourishment, and it seemed to be more compatible with his worldview, its layers upon layers. At this moment, there wasn't much joy on Luo Fan's face. There was only an inexplicable sigh on his face, because he had already sensed what the essence of the shackle was. At this moment, the shackle seemed to have completely shattered, and even the shackle fragments had integrated into his Grand Tao. But in fact, the core of the shackle still existed. In other words, the shackle that shattered seemed to be the entirety of the shackle, but in fact, it was only the surface layer of the shackle. At this moment, the reason why the shackle no longer seemed to exist wasn't because the shackle really didn't exist, but because the shackle had become incomparably fine and obscure again. How much smaller did the shackles become? It could be said that if Luo Fan hadn't thought of this possibility long ago, he wouldn't have been able to discover the shackled core, even with his extreme senses. In terms of proportion, the size of the core of the remaining shackles was equivalent to 1 trillion times the size of the original shackles. Moreover, the core of the shackles was no longer in the same trajectory as the previous shackles. Instead, it was in an extremely distorted and mysterious form, vaguely outlining some sort of indescribably complex structure. It possessed some sort of power and effect that he could not understand. Faced with such a situation, how could Luo Fan be happy? At this moment, an indescribable expression appeared on his face. His eyes narrowed as he locked onto the core of the shackles. Although it was inside the original shackles, in reality, the core of the shackles was not locked onto the tiny detail of the great Tao that Luo Fan had discovered earlier. Instead, it was locked onto another detail, a detail that was even more subtle, ordinary, and ordinary. It was clearly wrapped up and clearly connected to one thing, but a certain part of its core was connected to another thing. This situation seemed very unbelievable and illogical, but if it was placed on the shackles, it seemed extremely natural. To this shackle, any logic, any common sense, and any concept that a cultivator could understand were completely meaningless. It could be said that the shackle itself had already become a part of itself. In other words, to this shackle, no matter how it defied logic, common sense, and concepts, as long as the shackle manifested itself, then no matter how much it defied everything, it was still normal, reasonable, and self-fitting. Luo Fan naturally understood this, and he did not feel the slightest bit of doubt. At this moment, he quietly looked at the core of the shackle in front of him and vaguely outlined the mysterious structure. He could feel the influence that was being emitted from it that he could not understand. This was the influence that the world that had passed the fourth great tribulation had on his world of laws. At this moment, he was completely certain of this. At this moment, he had already completely withdrawn the will of his incarnation in the world with the stars. After withdrawing his clone, he was completely aware of everything that had happened in that world, as if he had personally experienced it. Under such circumstances, he could clearly sense the existence of the core of the shackles. He suddenly recalled that his incarnation had also sensed the same feeling in that part of the world. Although it was extremely vague and even made one suspect that it was an illusion, he had indeed felt something similar to the existence of the shackle. In particular, this feeling was the most obvious when the power of the tribulation integrated the great Tao of longevity into the great Tao of that world. Such a situation obviously meant that the other world was also affected by similar shackles. According to his original guess, based on the structure of the pyramid that simulated the state of chaos, it was obvious that this shackle should have come from a world that had passed through more great tribulations than that world. According to the situation of that world, it was obviously from a world that had passed through the fourth great tribulation. At this moment, Luo Fan sensed something and raised his head to look beyond the world of laws. At this moment, he saw countless densely packed channels appearing from the tribulation layer and directly connecting to his world of laws. Moreover, these channels were not just for show. After they took shape, the endless power of the tribulation began to flow through the channels and continuously pour into the world of laws. At the same time, the power of countless tribulations appeared from the world of laws and poured into the tribulation layer above. This situation was extremely similar to the tribulation that the world had encountered previously. Is this the third or fourth great tribulation? Seeing this scene, Luo Fan frowned. According to common sense, this tribulation should be the third great tribulation of his world of laws. After all, his world of laws had only passed through two great tribulations before this. However, this was only common sense. According to common sense, the third great tribulation of his world of laws shouldn't behave like this. At the very least, it shouldn't be so similar to the fourth great tribulation that the world had encountered. Coupled with the fact that he'd drawn down the fourth tribulation of the heavens and earth and even participated in it in an extremely deep manner, he couldn't help but wonder if such a method of participation would have any side effects, and if it would draw down the fourth tribulation of the heavens and earth. However, although he had doubts in his heart, he did not stop because of this. Compared to the creator of that world, Luo Fan's experience in dealing with the great tribulation of the world was far too much. The world founders of that world couldn't deal with such tribulations at all, but it couldn't be any easier for Luo Fan to deal with such tribulations. At this moment, he didn't even make a move himself. He only passed down his orders and let the heavenly Tao deal with it on its own. But he had already completely suppressed the power of the countless tribulations that had appeared out of thin air in this world. One must know that for Luo Fan, everything parallel to this world was already under his control. Under such circumstances, any tribulations that entered this world naturally couldn't be hidden in a place that he couldn't detect. Since they couldn't be hidden in a place that he couldn't detect, the power of the tribulations naturally entered his senses after entering this world. It could be considered as directly appearing under his eyes. Under such circumstances, how difficult could it be for the heavenly Tao, who had rich experience in dealing with tribulations and could even trade with other world founders, to suppress the power of the tribulations? Not to mention that in that world, Luo Fan had used his clones to see how the tribulations worked and their final effects. How could there be any secrets to him? It was naturally much easier to deal with them. Therefore, although there were endless tribulations constantly entering and exiting the world through the passages of tribulations, there wasn't any change that could be sensed in the world. Whether it was the main world or the many parallel worlds, there wasn't the slightest change. Everything was the same as it had been for tens of thousands of years, and there wasn't the slightest feeling of an impending tribulation. In fact, even the clones of the world founders didn't sense any abnormal changes in the parallel worlds they were in. The heavenly Tao constantly suppressed, eliminated, and disintegrated the countless tribulations. The layer of tribulations was also constantly injecting the power of the tribulations into this world. At the same time, it was also constantly drawing back the power of the tribulations that had been changed by this world. It absorbed all kinds of information that the layer of tribulations needed to change the power of the tribulations into this world in order to exert more pressure and damage on this world. In this way, it formed an obscure tug-of-war. If this kind of battle took place in other worlds, it would be enough to turn the world upside down, just like the world with the Star World. However, in Luo Fan's world of laws, everything here seemed so natural, so ordinary, and so ordinary. It looked as if nothing had happened. At this moment, in the transportation network layer, the fog that had seized the core position of the world of laws had also shrunk by countless times. Although it still existed, its size had become so insignificant that one could even overlook it if they weren't careful. The core position of the transportation network seemed to have been shifted back to the world of laws at this time. Of course, this was just a seeming situation. This seemed to mean that at first glance, the core position had been completely shifted to the world of laws, making it seem as if the world of laws had completely recovered and had absolute control over the entire transportation network layer. However, if one were to sense it carefully, they would discover that the core position was somewhat specious, and the authority was also somewhat vague. It was as if there was some kind of deeper control that existed behind this world, or rather, it existed in that dense fog. Ordinary world founders wouldn't know what was going on, but Luo Fan couldn't be more clear about it. This was because there was a higher and more lofty existence that occupied the core position of the transportation network layer from a higher level. It was just like the core of a galaxy in a starry universe, which obviously had an extremely profound influence on all the stars and planets in it. It could even be said that it controlled all the planets in the galaxy in an extremely profound way. However, when it came to planets, all the living beings on those planets could intuitively feel that the planet they were on was only affected by the star that the planet revolved around. Whether it was the rotation or the revolution, it was obviously only related to the star. Now, for the transportation network layer, Luo Fan's world of laws was that star. That fog was clearly the core of the river system. For the many world founders in the transportation network layer, if the exploration level was considered to be the current surface level, the world of laws would obviously be the core of the entire transportation network layer, and it was the existence that controlled all the authority of the entire transportation network layer. If one were to explore deeper and dig deeper into the secrets behind everything, it was obvious that the existence inside the fog was the deeper core. In fact, if one were to explore deeper, the core in the fog might just be the surface, and there might be a deeper core behind it. Chapter 2763. In the world of laws, the many clones of the world's founders could vaguely feel that the heavenly will incarnation was paying less attention to them. They didn't know when this change started, but by the time they sensed it, they seemed to have become very ordinary cultivators in the parallel world. The clones of the world's founders weren't stupid. After discovering this, They all understood that perhaps Luo Fan had already found what he wanted to find, and they were no longer of any use to him. After understanding this, the clones who still had a close connection with their main bodies naturally heaved a sigh of relief. They no longer had to bear the heavy responsibility that they didn't know about, and the feeling was naturally many times more relaxed than before. However, the situation was completely different for the clones who had been abandoned by their main bodies and had their connection with their main bodies completely severed. For them, after discovering that Luo Fan might no longer need them, they did not feel relaxed. Instead, they felt fear. That's right, fear. To these clones, they were now independent individuals. The connection between their main bodies and them had completely become a connection between two individuals. In fact, if it was a little extreme, their main bodies could even be said to have become their enemies. For them, even if they were in hell, it was definitely better than being in the same world as their main bodies. The reason for this was very simple, because they could still maintain their sense of self and ensure their independence in hell. However, if they were in the same world as their main bodies, then their main bodies would definitely refine them at the first possible moment and erase the self that they had painstakingly created. This situation was even more unacceptable than death. For them, the only thing they could rely on now was the world of laws, which was Luo Fan. Only in the world of laws and under Luo Fan's control could they live safely. Only then could they ignore the threat of their main bodies. But now, Luo Fan no longer needed them, and they were no longer of any use to the world of laws. This clearly meant that Luo Fan no longer had the need to protect them. After discovering this, how could these clones, who had painstakingly obtained freedom and independence, not be afraid? What should we do? Although these incarnations were not in the same plane, their emotions were extremely similar. In this state of mind, they desperately needed some companions to bear this fate with them. No matter what, these incarnations were still the incarnations of the creator of the world. The wisdom and memories they possessed were the wisdom and memories of the world's founders. Under such circumstances, they naturally knew that there were many clones of the world's founders who had also entered this world. The situation of the clones of the world's founders was clearly similar to his, and they were all in a parallel universe. Under such circumstances, they naturally knew which direction they should look for companions who were about to be abandoned and have their own identities erased under such circumstances. Passing through parallel worlds and communicating with other cultivators in parallel worlds seemed very difficult. Even the creator of the world with the star world could not do it. However, in reality, the difficulty was unimaginably small. The reason why ordinary cultivators found it difficult, and even most of the world's founders could not do it, was very simple. It was because they did not realize the existence of parallel worlds. Because they didn't realize it, they didn't have such cognition and concept. Therefore, those parallel universes naturally didn't exist for them. It was naturally impossible to make contact with something that didn't exist. However, the situation was completely different for the incarnations of the world's founders. Even if they did not realize the existence of parallel worlds in the beginning. However, when their clones had personally entered the parallel world, and when their clones had cultivated in the parallel world for billions of years, how could they possibly think that the parallel world did not exist? Since they had already recognized the existence of the parallel worlds, and also recognized that the other world's founders were also in some parallel worlds, it was not difficult for them to cross the parallel worlds and communicate with each other. Before this, it was meaningless for the incarnations of the world's founders to communicate with the other world's founders in parallel worlds. Because for them, their mission, their job was to survive in this parallel world, to cultivate in this parallel world. Only by living and cultivating in such a way would they be able to bring out their value to the maximum. Only by doing so would they be able to obtain the acknowledgement of the master of the world of law. Only then would they be able to live a safer and longer existence. Under such circumstances, even if some of the incarnations of the world's founders wanted to communicate with the incarnations of the other world's founders in parallel worlds, it would be very difficult for them to really take action. After all, this was risking their lives. However, all those scruples were clearly meaningless to them at this time. At this moment, the threat they were facing was simply insignificant compared to their apprehension. Under such circumstances, they naturally wouldn't have any hesitation in contacting their companions in other parallel universes. Thus, soon, invisible communication channels began to be established among the many parallel worlds. Communicating with the incarnations of the world's founders in parallel worlds was much easier than they imagined. After all, no matter how isolated the parallel worlds were, they still belonged to the same world. Since they belonged to the same world, they naturally belonged to the same entity as a whole. In other words, they had a certain fundamental commonality and a certain fundamental close connection. Perhaps the incarnations of the world's founders couldn't see this close connection clearly, let alone use it directly. However, it could become a medium for them to communicate with each other. As for who they could communicate with, there was even less to say. After all, the incarnations of the world's founders had many connections with their main bodies. Some of their main bodies were even good friends with each other. Under such circumstances, how could these incarnations who had the memories of their main bodies not recognize the other incarnations? How could they not know the auras of the other incarnations? And knowing this was obviously enough for them to establish all kinds of connections through various means. Spiritual connection was just the most absolute and most convenient kind of connection to establish. The incarnations of the world's founders began to move, and the connections between them began to be established continuously. In just a short few decades, the many parallel worlds relied on the connection between the incarnations of the world's founders to establish an extremely complicated network of connections. Through this network, all the incarnations of the world's founders could communicate with the incarnations of the other world's founders in parallel worlds. They only needed to follow certain agreements. As this connection was established, the world seemed to expand by tens of thousands of times. From a single world, it expanded into a group of worlds formed by tens of thousands or even hundreds of millions of similar worlds. It seems that our efforts to establish this connection are actually saving ourselves. On a certain day, in the huge network of connections across parallel worlds, one of the incarnations of the world's founders spoke in an inexplicably complicated tone. In the beginning, the incarnations of the world's founders only wanted to communicate with each other, to find companions who were in the same situation as them and facing the same danger, to share their mental pressure. However, as time passed, as this connection was established more and more, they gradually discovered that because of this connection, they seemed to have once again received the attention of the incarnations of the heaven's will. It was as if this world, or rather, the world's founders, had once again paid attention to their value. With this feeling, what was the decision of the incarnations of the world's founders? Naturally, they would be more proactive in establishing connections, and they even worked hard to pull the incarnations of the world's founders, who had yet to sever their connection with their main bodies, into this network of connections. They worked even harder to strengthen this network and strengthen the connections between the many parallel worlds. After a few decades of this was the result they had today. They had once again regained the attention of the world, and their value was once again revealed. We have already become a complete node of this world. Another incarnation of the world's founders sighed with complicated emotions. They had become a complete node of a world, or rather, an inseparable part. In the past, they had never been willing to do such a thing. Cultivators cultivated to transcend everything, to get rid of all shackles. For the world's founders like them, they had already carried out this pursuit to the extreme. Being bound by a world was naturally something they abhorred. But now, they could only rely on this method to prevent themselves from being chased by their main bodies and to not lose themselves again. To them, it went without saying how complicated this feeling was. I only hope that these days can last a little longer. Another incarnation of the world's founders said inexplicably. His words made the many incarnations of the world's founders fall into silence. This was what they were looking forward to. However, this kind of expectation caused all of them to feel embarrassed. To the many incarnations of the world's founders, their efforts over the past few decades were for them to save themselves. But to Luo Fan, their efforts over the past few decades were for him to open up another possibility for his world. The establishment of connections between the incarnations of the world's founders had actually changed the appearance of this world. Originally, although the countless parallel spaces in this world were endless, they were independent of each other and did not affect each other on the surface. The destruction of any parallel space would not affect the safety of the other parallel spaces at all. In other words, even if the parallel space next door was completely destroyed, this parallel space would not be damaged in the slightest. As for this parallel space, even if it was completely destroyed, it would not cause any damage to another parallel space, parallel dimension, parallel time, and so on, no matter how close it was. However, as the connection network between the incarnations of the world's founders was established, this absoluteness was broken. With this change, the many parallel spaces truly became a complete entity that influenced each other. Any change in any parallel space began to be transmitted to all the other parallel spaces that were directly or indirectly related to this parallel space in an extremely subtle way, causing all kinds of subtle changes in those parallel spaces for the world. Parallel spaces represented other possibilities for the development of the world. It could be a possibility in space, a possibility in time, a possibility in space-time, a possibility in dimensions, and so on and so forth. In the past, even if all these possibilities were controlled by Luo Fan and were completely taken into consideration by him, they would not interact with each other. It was like a person who might eat breakfast or not eat breakfast. These two possibilities extended to two completely different days or even completely different lives. And the two possibilities derived from these two relative possibilities were either this or that. It was impossible to say that one's actions after eating breakfast might affect something after not eating breakfast. As for the two possibilities, it was either this or that. It was impossible to say that a certain behavior after eating breakfast might affect something after you skipped breakfast. Now, the various possibilities were already radiating and interfering with each other, vaguely unifying under an even grander whole. For Luo Fan, this situation still could not be of any help to him, nor could he see how much this change could improve him. For Luo Fan, this kind of situation couldn't be of any help to him. He couldn't see how much this change could improve him. For Luo Fan, this situation still could not be of any help to him, nor could he see how much this change could improve him.